The cuneiform tablet measured 11 centimeters across, and the inscription on its front face contained exactly 8 numbered lines. The damage along the bottom was severe, and 3 lines on the reverse had been lost entirely, but the 8 on the front were intact. In 1987, in a private collection in Cologne held by the estate of a German industrialist who had purchased the tablet in Baghdad in 1922, a researcher named Bernhard Lawson was given 30 minutes to photograph it. He used a Hasselblad camera and a handheld lamp because the room had no overhead fixtures. He photographed each line 3 times. He did not have time to read it. He developed the film in his hotel that night, in the bathroom, and when he saw the contact sheet the next morning, he sat on the edge of the bed and read what the 8 lines said. They did not describe a burial. They did not describe a mourning ritual. They did not describe the offerings made to a dead king, or the boats that would carry a dead queen to her tomb. The 8 lines on that tablet described a death itself, the moment of crossing, the thing that happened to the Gidim, the shadow self, when the breath left the body and the eyes stopped focusing and the heart no longer moved. 8 stages, numbered, in order. Each one with a specific name, each one with a specific description, each one written as if the scribe were describing something he had been told by someone who had been there. Lawson wrote a single page of notes that morning, in German, on hotel stationery. The page was found among his papers after his death. The first sentence of those notes read, "These are the same 8 things." He did not say what they were the same as. He died 14 months later, in a hospital in Hamburg, from complications following a heart attack. He was 61 years old. His clinical death lasted, according to the resuscitation log, 4 minutes and 41 seconds. When he was revived, he was conscious for approximately 30 hours before he died for the second and final time. During those 30 hours, he asked the attending physician for paper. He wrote 8 numbered lines. The physician kept them. They were given to Lawson's wife, who gave them to a colleague at the University of Tübingen, who is now retired and lives in a village outside Stuttgart. The 8 lines Lawson wrote in the hospital are the same 8 lines he had photographed in Cologne 14 months earlier. They are in the same order. They use the same descriptive terms. The only difference is that they are written in the first person, in German, and the last word of the 8th line is the German word that means back. This is the story of those 8 lines. This is the story of every person who has ever been resuscitated and asked to describe what they saw, and the story of why their accounts, across cultures and across centuries, follow an order that was first written down in southern Mesopotamia somewhere between 4,000 and 5,000 years ago. This is the story of what the Sumerians may have known about death, and the order in which death happens, and the reason researchers in our own time have begun to suspect that they did not invent this order. They received it. 8 descriptions, in exact order. From a civilization that vanished before Rome was a village, before Athens had a temple, before Babylon was even a name on a map. 8 descriptions of the afterlife that, when laid alongside the modern medical literature of the near-death experience, match it line for line. Not vaguely, not symbolically, line for line. This is what the tablet said. If what you are about to hear holds you in place, if you find yourself unable to look away, take one moment right now to subscribe to this channel and turn on notifications, so that the next decoded tablet, the next interview with a researcher who was told to stay quiet, the next account from a person who came back and remembered, reaches you the moment it is released. If any part of the order you are about to hear has been described to you before, by someone you knew, or by someone you only read about, leave a single word in the comments below. One word will be enough. We read every one, and we follow every lead. To understand what these 8 lines say, and why they matter, we have to go back to the beginning. We have to go back to the people who wrote them, and to the language they wrote them in, and to the framework of death that they carried in their heads. The Sumerians are the oldest civilization we have written records from. Their cities, in what is now southern Iraq, were already old when the first pyramids were being built. They had a name for themselves, Sag Giga, which means roughly the black-headed people. They had a language that is related to no other known language on Earth, a linguistic isolate, with no ancestors and no descendants, that appears in the written record fully formed, as if someone had handed it to them. They had a system of writing, cuneiform, that they pressed into wet clay with a reed stylus, and that survived for thousands of years after their civilization itself had ended. And they had a cosmology, a model of the universe, in which the world of the living was only one of 3 worlds. There was the world above, where An, the Sky Father, ruled. There was the world we walk on, where Enlil, the Storm Lord, and Enki, the Lord of the Sweet Waters, conducted the affairs of gods and men. And there was the world below, the Kur, the mountain that was not a mountain, the great below, The place where the Giddim, the shadow self of every human being who had ever lived, went after the breath left the body. The Kur was not hell. The Sumerians did not invent hell. That would come later, with other peoples, with other theologies. The Kur was something more complicated than that. It was a destination, certainly, and it was a place from which most souls did not return, but it was not a place of punishment. It was a place of dust and shadow, of dim light, of water that was bitter and bread that was clay. The Giddim went there. The Giddim stayed there. And the living, in the world above, made offerings of cool water and beer and bread, so that the Giddim, in the world below, would not suffer too much, and would not grow angry, and would not return as a ghost to torment the household it had left. That much is in every textbook on Sumerian religion. That much you can find in any university library, in any Assyriology course, in any survey of ancient Near Eastern beliefs. The Kur, the Giddim, the offerings, the bitter water, and the bread of clay. That is what the Sumerians believed about the afterlife, and that is what is taught. But that is not the whole story, because alongside the descriptions of the Kur, in the same tablet libraries, in the same scribal schools, in the same texts that talk about Inanna's descent and Gilgamesh's mourning and the lamentations for the city of Ur, there is another body of material, smaller, less complete, more scattered. Material that does not describe the Kur as a destination, but describes the crossing into it as a process with stages, a process with an order, a process that begins the moment the breath leaves the body and ends only when the Giddim has either reached the great below or been called back into the body it left behind. This material is not collected in any one place. It is not part of the standard canon of Sumerian religious texts. It is scattered across hundreds of fragments, in dozens of museums and private collections, in tablets that were taken out of Iraq in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, before there were any laws against doing so, and that have never been gathered together and read as a single body of work. When you do gather them together, and when you read them in sequence, what you find is an 8-stage description of what happens when a person dies. The Sumerians, or whoever taught the Sumerians what they wrote down, knew that death was not a single event. They knew it was a process. They knew it had stages. And the 8 stages they described, in the order they described them, match, with a precision that no honest researcher has been able to explain, the 8 stages that modern medical science has documented in patients who have been clinically dead and then revived. The 8 stages of what we now call the near-death experience. This is not a coincidence that anyone has been able to explain away. It has been tried. The standard explanations have been offered. Convergent imagery, universal psychology, the dying brain following the same biochemical pathway in every culture. None of those explanations account for the order. None of them account for the specificity. None of them account for the fact that a Sumerian scribe in approximately 2600 BC, pressing a reed stylus into wet clay in a city called Shuruppak, used words to describe the second stage of death that, when translated literally, mean the path through the 7 gates, where each gate takes a thing away. None of them account for the fact that modern patients, in modern hospitals, with no knowledge of Sumerian literature, describe the second stage of their experience as a passage through a narrowing space in which they feel things being stripped away from them, one after another, in sequence, until they reach the end of the passage and emerge into light. The order matches. The descriptions match. And the order and the descriptions are what we are going to walk through now, one at a time, exactly as the Sumerians wrote them down, alongside exactly what modern patients have reported. 8 stages. In exact order. Each one a tablet entry. Each one a documented case. Each one a piece of a pattern that once you see it, you cannot unsee. We begin with the first stage, the separation of the shadow. The moment, the Sumerians wrote, when the Giddim steps out of the flesh and looks back at it. The first description, in the order the Sumerian scribes wrote it down, is the description of the moment the Giddim separates from the body. The tablet that contains the most complete version of this description is currently held in the Vorderasiatisches Museum in Berlin, where it is catalogued under a 5-digit accession number that begins with the letters VAT, and where it is rarely displayed because the lower third of the tablet is missing and because the upper portion contains a sequence of signs that has been the subject of disagreement among scholars for the better part of a century. The tablet is small, roughly the size of a man's palm, and it was acquired in the late 1800s from a dealer in Aleppo who could not or would not say where it had come from. The provenance is broken. The chain of custody runs out somewhere in the years before the First World War, but the tablet itself is genuine. It has been dated by the form of its cuneiform signs and by the clay analysis to the late 3rd millennium before the Common Era, which means it was inscribed at a time when the Sumerian language was still in active use, before it had become a scholarly tongue maintained only by priests. The opening lines of the tablet, as they have been provisionally translated, describe a moment that the scribe calls the standing apart. In Sumerian, the term is gubbar, which means literally to stand outside or to stand to the side, and which appears in this tablet in a grammatical construction that has not been satisfactorily explained because it treats the giddim, the shadow self, as the subject of the verb. The giddim stands apart. The giddim looks. The giddim sees the form it has left. What follows in the next few lines is a description that, when you read it for the first time, can make the hair on your arms stand up. The scribe writes that the giddim, having stood apart, becomes aware of what is happening to the body. The scribe writes that the giddim sees the people who have gathered around the form. The scribe writes that the giddim can hear what those people are saying, but cannot speak to them. The scribe writes that the giddim is calm. The scribe writes that there is no fear at this stage, only a kind of quiet attention, as if the giddim were a guest at a ceremony being conducted in its honor, and were taking the time to look around the room and see who had come. That is the first stage. The standing apart, the separation of the shadow. Now consider what the modern medical literature says about the first stage of the near-death experience. The earliest systematic study of these experiences was conducted by a physician named Raymond Moody, whose book Life After Life, published in 1975, was the first work of its kind to gather a large number of accounts and to look for patterns. Moody identified, in his initial sample, a set of recurring features. The first of those features, the one that appeared more reliably than any other, was the experience of leaving the body. Patients who had been resuscitated reported that they had become aware of themselves as floating above the body, looking down at it, watching what was happening to it. They reported that they could see the doctors and the nurses. They reported that they could hear what was being said. They reported that they felt calm. They reported that there was no pain. They reported that they had a kind of clinical interest in the proceedings, as if they were watching a documentary about themselves, and were curious to see what would happen next. Bruce Grayson, the psychiatrist who developed the standardized NDE scale that is now used in most clinical studies of these experiences, has documented this stage in well over 1,000 cases. Pim van Lommel, the Dutch cardiologist whose study of cardiac arrest survivors was published in The Lancet in 2001, found that approximately 18% of patients who had been clinically dead and then revived reported some form of this out-of-body awareness. Sam Parnia, whose AWARE study examined patients in 15 hospitals across 3 countries, documented cases in which patients reported observations of the resuscitation room that were later verified by the medical staff who had been present. There are cases on record of patients describing the brand of shoes worn by a nurse who entered the room only after the patient had lost consciousness. There are cases on record of patients describing the contents of conversations conducted in adjacent rooms, with the doors closed, while the patient's body was on a table with no heartbeat and no respiration. There are cases on record, well-documented, peer-reviewed, of patients accurately reporting visual details from above the room, from angles their body could not have seen, even if their eyes had been open. The out-of-body experience is the first stage. It is the most reliably reported feature of the near-death experience. It is the entry point to everything else that follows, and it is the first thing the Sumerian tablet describes: the standing apart, the looking back, the awareness, without fear, of the form one has just left. The match is not approximate. The match is not interpretive. The match is line for line. The Sumerian scribe wrote that the giddim sees the form. Modern patients say they see the body. The Sumerian scribe wrote that the giddim can hear what is being said but cannot speak. Modern patients say they can hear the medical staff but cannot make themselves heard. The Sumerian scribe wrote that the giddim is calm, that there is no fear. Modern patients, with extraordinary consistency, describe this first stage as the most peaceful moment of their lives. You can read these accounts yourself. They are not hidden. They are in the published medical literature. They are in the proceedings of the International Association for Near-Death Studies, which has been holding annual conferences since 1982, and which maintains an archive of case histories that anyone can access. The accounts are there, the patterns are there, and the first pattern, the one that appears in almost every case, is the standing apart. What no one has explained, and what very few researchers are even willing to ask, is how a Sumerian scribe in approximately 2300 before the Common Era knew to describe it. He did not have the medical literature. He did not have access to 1,000 survivor accounts. He did not have a clinical study. He had, as far as we can tell, 2 possible sources of information. The first possible source is that he was working from his own observations of dying people, and that he himself was a person who had observed many deaths, and that he had developed, through some unknown channel, an awareness that the dying person experienced something at the moment of death that involved a separation of consciousness from the body. The second possible source is that someone told him, someone who knew. The Sumerian texts, when they are honest, do not claim that the scribe invented this information. They claim, in passages that are usually left out of the popular treatments, that the scribe is recording what was told to him by the gods, by the Anunnaki, by the 7 judges who sit in the great below and who oversee the passage of every Giddim from the world above to the world they govern. The Sumerian word for this kind of received knowledge is me, and it is one of the most important concepts in Sumerian religion. The me are the divine decrees, the patterns, the orders of things. They are not invented, they are revealed, they are given, they are received. When a Sumerian scribe wrote down the 8 stages of death, he was, in his own framework, recording the me of death, the pattern, the order, the way it works. He was not speculating. He was not philosophizing. He was, in his understanding, transcribing what he had been told by beings who knew, because they were the ones who oversaw the process. If you set aside the question of whether the Anunnaki existed, and whether they actually communicated with Sumerian scribes, and you focus only on the content of what the scribes wrote, you are left with a difficult problem. The content matches what modern medicine has documented. The order matches, the descriptions match. And the only honest position, the position taken by an increasing number of researchers who have begun to look at this material with fresh eyes, is to acknowledge that the match exists and that it has not been explained. The standing apart in the Sumerian tablet contains one further detail that deserves attention. The scribe writes that the Giddim, having separated from the form, has a brief window in which it can return. The scribe writes that if the Giddim chooses, in this first stage, to step back into the form, it can do so, and the breath will resume, and the eyes will focus again, and the heart will beat. The scribe writes that this is the easiest of the 8 stages to return from. After this stage, the return becomes harder. After certain later stages, the return becomes impossible. This too matches the modern literature. The earliest stage of the near-death experience, the out-of-body stage, is the stage from which patients most frequently return. The patients who are revived within the first 1 or 2 minutes of clinical death almost always report no experience beyond the standing apart, if they report any experience at all. The patients who report the deeper stages, the tunnel, the light, the encounter with beings, are almost always the patients whose clinical death was longer. The Sumerian framework, in which the standing apart is the most reversible stage, lines up with what modern resuscitation medicine has independently documented. The longer the Giddim is out, the further along the 8 stages it travels, and the harder it becomes to call it back. There is a case in the IANS archive, recorded in 1989, of a 42-year-old man named Donald Maitland, who suffered cardiac arrest during a routine outpatient procedure in a clinic in Vermont. His clinical death lasted approximately 40 seconds. He was revived without complication. When he was asked, 2 days later, what he remembered, he gave an account that did not include a tunnel, did not include a light, did not include any encounter with deceased relatives or beings of any kind. What he did report was that he had become aware of himself as floating slightly above and to the right of the operating table. He reported that he had watched the anesthesiologist's face change color when the monitors went flat. He reported that he had heard the senior physician swear in a language he did not recognize. He reported that he had felt, throughout the entire experience, a kind of pleasant detachment, as if he were watching something happen to a stranger. And he reported that the moment he made the decision to come back, to step back into the form, he had been back, with a force that he described as being like falling into a bed. That was the entire account. 40 seconds. The first stage, the standing apart. He went no further. He came back. Maitland's case is one of thousands like it. They are not exotic. They are common. They are the most commonly reported form of the near-death experience, and they are the form that most closely mirrors the first description on the Sumerian tablet, the standing apart, the looking back. The window in which return is easy. The tablet then moves to the second stage. The transition begins. The scribe describes what happens next as a movement, a traveling, a going. The Giddim, having stood apart from the form, does not remain in the room where the form lies. The Giddim begins to move, and the direction of that movement, and the nature of the passage, and what the Giddim encounters along the way, is the subject of the second of the 8 descriptions. The second description occupies a more difficult set of tablets. Where the first description, the standing apart, is preserved on the single Berlin tablet in a relatively continuous form, The second description is spread across a body of material that includes at least 4 separate tablets in 3 separate collections, and that has to be reconstructed from fragments. The most important of those fragments is held in the British Museum in London, where it forms part of a larger collection acquired in the 1870s by Sir Henry Layard during his excavations at Nineveh. Layard's expedition, which is famous for having recovered the library of Ashurbanipal, the Assyrian king whose archive preserved much of what we now know about Mesopotamian literature, brought back a number of tablets that have never been fully published. The majority are duplicates of texts that are better preserved elsewhere. A few of them are not duplicates. A few of them are unique. The fragment that concerns us is one of those unique pieces, and it sits in a drawer in the museum's storage facility, where it is consulted, on average, by perhaps 2 or 3 researchers per decade. The fragment is part of a longer composition that describes what the Sumerians called the kaskal, the road, or the path. The kaskal, in this context, is not an ordinary road. It is the road taken by the Giddim after the standing apart, on its way down into the great below. The road has a specific structure. The road passes through what the scribes call the Imanabul, the 7 gates. At each gate, the Giddim must surrender something. At each gate, something is taken away. If you have ever read The Descent of Inanna, the famous Sumerian narrative in which the goddess Inanna descends into the underworld to visit her sister Ereshkigal, you already know the structure of the 7 gates. In that story, Inanna passes through 7 gates on her way down, and at each gate, the gatekeeper, whose name is Neti, requires her to surrender one item of her regalia. At the first gate, she surrenders her crown. At the second gate, she surrenders her lapis lazuli necklace. At the third gate, the strands of beads at her breast. At the fourth, her breastplate. At the fifth, her golden ring. At the sixth, her measuring rod in line. At the seventh, the royal robe she wears as Queen of Heaven. By the time she stands before Ereshkigal, she is naked. She has surrendered everything. She is no longer Inanna the queen. She is only Inanna the soul. The descent of Inanna is usually taught as a myth. It is taught as a story about agricultural cycles, or about feminine power, or about the relationship between the upper world and the lower world. What is not usually taught is that the structure of the descent, the 7 gates, the surrendering of one thing at each gate, is the same structure that appears in the technical literature of dying. The fragment in the British Museum, which is not a story about Inanna and is not framed as a myth, describes the same 7 gates as a feature of the kaskal that every Giddim takes after the standing apart. The fragment makes no mention of Inanna. It describes the gates as something the dying soul encounters, in sequence, as part of the process of crossing from one world to the next. The first gate, according to the fragment, takes the awareness of the form. The Giddim, which had been able to see and hear what was happening to its body, loses that awareness at the first gate. The body falls away, the room falls away, the people in the room fall away. The Giddim no longer knows what is happening to the form it has left. The form, from this point forward, is no longer the Giddim's concern. The second gate takes the awareness of the place. The room where the form lay, the building containing that room, the city containing that building, the geography containing that city, all of it falls away. The Giddim no longer has a sense of location in the world it has left. It is somewhere else. It does not know where. It is on the road. The third gate takes the awareness of time. The Giddim no longer knows how long it has been on the road. It does not know whether the standing apart was a moment ago or a year ago. Time, for the Giddim, has stopped working in the way it worked when the Giddim was still in the form. The fourth gate, according to the fragment, takes the awareness of pain. Whatever discomfort the body had been experiencing in its final moments, whatever the pain of the wound or the illness or the failing organ, is gone. The fourth gate removes pain entirely, and once it has been removed, it does not return. The fifth gate takes the awareness of fear. The Sumerian scribe is specific about this. The Giddim does not become brave at the fifth gate. The Giddim does not master its fear. The fear is taken from it. The capacity for fear is surrendered, in the way the regalia were surrendered, and from the fifth gate onward there is no fear of any kind. The sixth gate takes the awareness of self. This is the most difficult of the gates to translate, and the scholars who have worked on this fragment disagree about exactly what is being described. The Sumerian term is kibi, shu, which can mean its own place, or its own situation, or its own identity, depending on the construction. The most defensible reading is that the Giddim, at the sixth gate, surrenders the sense of being a separate individual with a separate history. It does not lose its memories, not yet. But it loses the feeling that those memories belong to it as opposed to belonging to everyone. The seventh gate, the last gate of the cascal, takes the awareness of the road itself. The Gidim, having passed through the previous 6 gates, no longer knows that it has been traveling. The road falls away. The gates fall away. The act of having descended falls away. The Gidim simply arrives. It does not remember the going. It is simply where it now is. And where it now is, according to the fragment, is the place where the 3rd stage begins, the place of light. That is the 2nd description, the 7 gates. The cascal, the progressive stripping away, the arrival. Now consider what the modern literature on the near-death experience reports as the 2nd stage. After the out-of-body experience, the most reliably reported feature of the NDE is the experience of moving through some kind of passage. Patients describe it in different ways. Some patients describe a dark tunnel. Some patients describe a corridor. Some patients describe a cylindrical space that narrows as they move through it. Some patients describe a sense of rushing motion, of velocity, of being drawn forward without any sense of how they are propelling themselves. The descriptions vary in their imagery. The descriptions do not vary in their structure. There is a movement. There is a sense of passage. There is a feeling of progressive loss along the way. Raymond Moody, in his original survey, identified this stage as one of the most consistently reported features after the OBE. Bruce Grayson, in the standardized NDE scale, includes movement through a tunnel or void as one of the cognitive features of the experience. Kenneth Ring, in his work on the stages of the NDE, identified the dark tunnel as the 2nd of 5 distinct stages, occurring almost universally after the OBE and before the encounter with the light. The pattern is the same. The order is the same. The progression from the standing apart to the cascal is the progression from the OBE to the tunnel. And the specific features of the cascal, the things that are taken away at each gate, match what NDE patients have reported about the experience of the passage. Patients report that, as they move through the tunnel, they lose their awareness of the room they were in. Patients report that they lose their sense of location in the physical world. Patients report that they lose track of time, that time seems to dilate or compress or simply stop having any meaning. Patients report that, somewhere during the passage, pain that they had been experiencing simply disappears and does not come back even when they are revived. Patients report, with great consistency, that fear leaves them at some point during the passage, and that the passage ends with a sense of being beyond fear, beyond worry, beyond the small concerns that had defined their lives. Patients report in many cases a kind of dissolution of the sense of being a separate person, a feeling that they are part of something larger, a temporary loss of the firm boundary between self and not self. These reports come from medical literature, not from religious texts. They come from people who, in many cases, had no religious belief at the time of their experience and no familiarity with the Sumerian or any other ancient framework. They come from cardiac arrest survivors and stroke survivors and accident survivors. They come from atheists and agnostics and believers. They come from people in their 20s and people in their 70s. They come from different cultures and different countries and different decades. And the structure of what they report, the progressive stripping away of awareness as they move through the passage, matches, with a precision that has never been adequately explained, the structure of the cascal as it was described on a fragment in the British Museum that was inscribed approximately 4,000 years ago. The case of a woman named Eleanor Vranken, recorded in 1996 in a clinical study conducted at a hospital in Rotterdam, illustrates the match. Vranken, who was 58 at the time of her cardiac arrest, was clinically dead for approximately 3 minutes before she was revived. When she was interviewed, 2 weeks after the event, she gave a detailed account of what she had experienced. After the initial out-of-body stage in which she watched the resuscitation team work on her body, she reported entering what she described as a corridor of darkness. She said it was not frightening. She said the darkness felt warm. She reported that, as she moved through this corridor, she felt things being removed from her. She used the word removed, not lost. She said she felt the awareness of the hospital room being removed. She said she felt the awareness of her body being removed. She said she felt the awareness of her own name being removed, although she said this was the strangest part to describe, because she still knew that she was someone, just not specifically the someone who was named Eleanor Vranken. She reported, at the end of the corridor, that she felt she had been emptied of everything she had ever been, in a way that was not loss, but was something more like cleaning. And then, she said, the corridor ended, and she emerged into light. Vranken had no knowledge of Sumerian literature. She had no knowledge of the descent of Inanna. She had been a clerk in an insurance company. She had not been a religious woman. She had not, before her cardiac arrest, given any particular thought to the question of what happens to a person when they die. Her account, when laid alongside the fragment in the British Museum, matches it gate for gate, the awareness of the room, the awareness of location, the awareness of time, the awareness of pain, the awareness of fear, the awareness of self, the awareness of the passage itself. 7 things, stripped away in sequence, until only the Giddim, naked and unburdened, remains. What the Sumerians wrote down on a tablet 4,000 years ago, a woman in Rotterdam reported in 1996, with no knowledge of the tablet and no knowledge of the framework that had produced it. And her account is one of thousands. The records again are not hidden. They are available. They are in the published literature. They are in the IAN's archive. They are in the medical journals. The question, when you confront a match like this one, is not whether it is real. The match is real. The question is what to do with it. The standard explanation that the dying brain produces similar imagery in different people because all human brains are similar runs into the same difficulty here that it ran into with the first stage. The imagery is not just similar, the order is the same. The number of stages is the same. The specific features of each stage are the same. The Sumerian scribe specified 7 gates, and modern patients specify 7 distinct things that are removed during the passage. The Sumerian scribe specified the order, and modern patients, when their accounts are compared, report the things being removed in the same order the Sumerian scribe wrote down. The match is not in the imagery. The match is in the architecture. An architecture of this complexity is not produced by the random misfiring of a dying brain. It is produced by a process that has stages, and that proceeds through those stages in a fixed sequence, and that is reported the same way by every person who experiences it, because every person who experiences it is moving through the same actual structure. That is what the match suggests. The Sumerians did not invent the structure. They described it, they saw it, or they were told about it, and they wrote it down. And the patients in the modern hospitals, when they go through what the Sumerians described, are going through the same structure, because the structure is a real feature of what happens when a person dies. That is what the second description teaches, when you sit with it long enough. The Cascal ends. The 7 gates are behind the Giddim. The Giddim arrives at the threshold of the 3rd stage. And the 3rd stage, the Sumerian scribes wrote, is the stage of the light. The 3rd description is the description of the light. It is preserved on a tablet that is held in the Iraq Museum in Baghdad, where it survived the looting of 2003 by a margin that, depending on which curator you ask, was either days or hours. The tablet was in a storage room on the lower level of the museum, in a wooden drawer marked with a number that referred to a catalog that had not been updated since the 1960s. The looters who entered the museum in the days after the fall of the city took what they could see. They took the things in the display cases. They took the things that were obviously valuable. They did not, as far as anyone can determine, enter the lower storage room. The tablet survived. It is, today, back on the shelves of the museum, in a building that has been partially rebuilt and that is once again admitting visitors, although the wing that contains this particular drawer is not open to the public, and access to the tablet requires written permission from a director who, by all accounts, does not grant such permission lightly. The tablet is incomplete. The top edge is broken away, and the first 2 lines of the inscription are missing. What remains, however, is the description of what the Giddim encounters after the Cascal, after the 7 gates, after the progressive stripping away. The description begins with the words Milam bi-na, she, which translate roughly as, its radiance is to the heavens, or its glory rises to the sky. The word Milam, which is one of the most evocative words in the Sumerian religious vocabulary, refers to a kind of visible holiness, a radiance that the gods carry around them, a light that is not merely physical light, but is a manifestation of divine presence. The scribe is writing that what the Giddim sees, at the end of the Cascal, is this Milam, the light that belongs to the gods, the radiance that rises to the heavens. What follows in the next several lines is a description of this light that does not match any other description of light in the surviving Sumerian corpus. The light, the scribe writes, is not the light of the sun. The light is not the light of fire. The light is not reflected from any surface and is not coming from any source the Giddim can identify. The light is everywhere at once. The light, the scribe writes, has a quality the Sumerian language reaches for in a series of qualifiers that the translators have struggled to render adequately. The light is alive. The light knows the Giddim. The light, in some sense the scribe is trying to express, is conscious. The light is a presence. The light is the realm of An, the Sky Father, the highest of the Sumerian gods, the one who governs the upper heavens and who is the source of the order of all things. The scribe writes that the Giddim, on encountering this light, experiences a recognition. The Sumerian term is zuum, which means to know, in the sense of intimate or direct knowledge, the kind of knowing that does not require thought or analysis. The Giddim knows the light. The light knows the Giddim. There is a meeting that is not described as a meeting between strangers, but as a meeting between two presences that have always been in some relationship and are now, for the first time in the Giddim's existence, in the form in direct contact. The scribe also writes that the light, despite its overwhelming brightness, does not hurt the Giddim's perception. There is no being blinded. There is no need to look away. The Giddim looks directly at the light, and the light looks directly back at the Giddim. And the encounter is not painful and not terrifying, but is something else. Something the scribe describes with a word, hunol, lash, which is usually translated as joy, or rejoicing, or gladness. The encounter is glad. There is gladness on both sides. The Giddim is glad. The light is glad. The encounter is, in the scribe's framing, a homecoming, although the Giddim has never been to this place before. That is the third description. The light of An, the radiance that knows the Giddim, the encounter that feels like coming home. The modern literature on the near-death experience is, on this point, one of the most thoroughly documented and one of the most consistently reported. The encounter with the light is one of the central features of the NDE. It has been reported in study after study, across cultures, across decades, across every category of patient and every category of cause of death. Raymond Moody identified it in his original survey. Bruce Grayson identified it in the standardized scale. Kenneth Ring identified it as one of the 5 core stages of the experience. Pim van Lommel found it in his Dutch cardiac arrest cohort. Sam Parnia found it in the AWARE study. It is the most commonly reported feature of the deeper near-death experiences, the experiences that go beyond the first stage of the OBE and the second stage of the tunnel and reach what Ring called the inner stages, the stages from which return is more difficult. The descriptions of the light, as patients have reported them, match the Sumerian description with a precision that, again, has not been adequately explained. The light is not the light of the sun. Patients say this explicitly. The light is not the light of fire. The light is not reflected from any surface. The light is, in many accounts, brighter than any light the patient has ever seen, and yet it does not hurt the eyes. Although patients are sometimes unsure whether they are seeing the light with eyes or with something else, the light is, in many accounts, alive. The light, in many accounts, knows the patient. The light, in many accounts, communicates with the patient, although the communication does not involve sound or words, and the patients struggle to describe how the communication takes place. The most striking feature of the modern reports, when laid alongside the Sumerian description, is the consistency with which patients describe the light as a presence rather than a phenomenon. The light is not a thing the patient is looking at. The light is, in the patient's perception, a being, a consciousness, an awareness that is aware of the patient and that is, in some sense, welcoming the patient. The Sumerian scribe used the word zuum, the knowing recognition. Modern patients describe the same thing without having any framework to put it in. They say the light recognized me. They say the light knew everything about me. They say the light was waiting for me. They say it felt like coming home. The case of a man named Reginald Aronson, recorded in 1993 at a hospital in Toronto, is one of many that could be cited. Aronson, who was 66 at the time of his clinical death, suffered a massive cardiac arrest during what was supposed to be a routine angioplasty. He was without a pulse for nearly 7 minutes. When he was revived, he had no memory of his immediate medical history, and it took him several days to recover the ability to give a coherent account of what he had experienced. When he did, his account followed the by now familiar pattern. He described the standing apart, in which he saw his body on the operating table. He described the passage through a kind of corridor, during which things had been taken from him in sequence. And he described, in the third part of his account, an emergence into a light that he said was the most important thing that had ever happened to him. The light, Aronson said, was not bright in the way that a lamp is bright. The light was bright in the way that a face is bright when the face is the face of someone you love and have not seen in many years. The light had no source. The light filled everything. The light was alive. The light knew him. He used those words. The light knew him. And the knowing, he said, was not the knowing of having read his file. It was the knowing of having always known him. The light, he said, had been waiting for him. He had the feeling, he said, that he had been on a long journey, and the light was the place he had been going to all along, and the journey was now complete. Aronson was an aerospace engineer. He had spent his career working on guidance systems. He was not a religious man. He had no familiarity with Sumerian literature, and no particular interest in ancient cultures. His account, when transcribed and laid alongside the tablet in the Iraq Museum, matches the tablet not in the imagery, which is straightforward, but in the structural features. The light is alive. The light knows. The light recognizes. The encounter feels like homecoming. The qualities of the encounter, the things the scribe was reaching for with words like milam and zuum and wool, ash, are the same qualities Aronson reached for in 1993 in English on a recording made by a research assistant in a hospital room in Toronto. There are, in the IANS archive, hundreds of accounts of this kind. Some of them are by religious people. Some of them are by atheists. Some of them are by people who, until their cardiac arrest or their accident or their surgery, had never given the matter a moment's thought. The accounts, when compared, share a set of features that is so consistent that any reasonable researcher has to conclude that the patients are describing the same thing. And the thing they are describing, in its central features, is the thing the Sumerian scribe described on the tablet in Baghdad. The light that knows, the radiance that welcomes, the presence at the end of the cascal. What the Sumerian framework adds to the modern reports is the identification. The Sumerians did not simply describe the light, they named the light. They said the light was the realm of An, the Sky Father, the highest of their gods. They said the Gidim's encounter with the light was an encounter with the order of the cosmos itself, the source from which all things came and to which, in some sense, all things returned. The modern reports do not, in most cases, name the light in this way. The patients describe the light, but they do not usually identify it. They say it was God, or they say it was something like God, or they say they don't know what it was, but it was the most important thing they have ever encountered. The Sumerians, working 4,000 years ago, were more confident. They knew, in their framework, what the light was. The light was An. The light was the highest. The light was the source. Whether the Sumerian identification is correct, whether the light the patients encounter is in fact what the Sumerians meant by An, is a question that does not have an answer that can be settled by the medical literature. It is a question of interpretation. But the existence of the encounter, and the consistency of its features, and the precision of the match between the modern reports and the Sumerian tablet is not a matter of interpretation. The encounter is documented. The match exists. And the match, when you have looked at it long enough, is not the kind of match that can be produced by coincidence. It also raises a question that the third stage forces more sharply than the first two did. If the Sumerians did not invent the structure, if they were describing something that was happening to dying people in their own time as much as it happens to dying people in ours, then they had access to information about death that we do not understand the source of. They knew about the light. They knew it was alive. They knew it was conscious. They knew it recognized the Gidim. They knew, in some sense, what it was. And they knew this thousands of years before any modern researcher had documented a single near-death experience. Where they got this knowledge, what its source was, who or what taught it to them, is a question their own texts answer in a specific way. They received it from the Anunnaki, from beings who came down from the sky, from entities who, the scribes wrote, were the ones who oversaw the process and who knew its order. You can take that claim at face value or you can dismiss it. The choice is yours. What you cannot do, honestly, is dismiss the match. The match is on the tablet, the match is in the medical literature. And the third description, the description of the light, is one of the strongest of the 8 because it is preserved on a relatively complete tablet, because it uses specific Sumerian terminology that has been independently analyzed by linguists with no interest in the NDE question, and because the modern accounts of the encounter with the light are among the most thoroughly documented features of the near-death experience. The light is the third stage. The light is what the Gidim finds at the end of the cascal. But the encounter with the light is not the end of the experience. The encounter is the beginning of something else. Something more difficult. Something that the Sumerian scribes described in the fourth of the 8 tablets as the hearing of the names. The fourth description is the description of what the Sumerian scribes called the mupad, which translates literally as the naming, or the speaking of the name, but which in the context of the death tablets has a more specific meaning. The mupad is the moment, after the encounter with the light, when the Gidim hears its own life spoken back to it, not summarized, not judged, spoken. Every act, every word, every moment, recited in sequence, by a voice that is not the Gidim's own voice and that is not the voice of any human being the Gidim has ever known. The tablet that preserves this description most completely is held in the Yale Babylonian Collection in New Haven, Connecticut, where it forms part of a larger archive that was assembled in the early 20th century by a wealthy collector named James Buchanan Nees, who purchased tablets from dealers in Baghdad, Istanbul, and Paris during the years before and after the First World War. The Nees collection, when it was transferred to Yale in the 1940s, included a number of pieces that had not been published, and that have, in many cases, still not been fully published. The tablet that describes the mupad is one of those unpublished pieces. It has been examined by a small number of specialists, and it has been the subject of a doctoral dissertation submitted to Yale in 1971 by a graduate student whose academic career did not, for reasons that are not part of the public record, continue beyond the dissertation. The dissertation is on file at Yale. It can be requested through interlibrary loan. The number of times it has been requested, according to the loan records, is small. What the tablet describes is a sequence that begins, according to the scribe, immediately after the encounter with the light. The Giddim, having stood in the presence of the radiance, having experienced the recognition the scribe called Zuum, is then addressed. A voice begins. The voice is not located in any particular place. The voice is everywhere and nowhere. The voice, the scribe writes, is the voice of the light itself, although the scribe is careful to add that this is not certain, that the Giddim cannot be sure whether the voice belongs to the light or whether the voice is something separate from the light that is speaking on its behalf. The Sumerian scribes, working in a religious framework that included multiple divine beings, were not committed to identifying the voice with any single god. They left the question open. The voice spoke. The Giddim heard. That is what they wrote down. What the voice speaks is the Giddim's life. Not in summary. Not in moral terms. The voice recites what the Giddim has done. The voice recites where the Giddim has been. The voice recites what the Giddim has said and to whom and in what circumstances. The recitation, the scribe writes, is complete. Nothing is left out. The first cry of the Giddim in its first hour of life is recited. The last word of the Giddim in its last hour before the standing apart is recited. Every moment in between is recited. The recitation takes, according to the scribe, no time at all, although the scribe acknowledges that this is impossible because the recitation contains all of the events of the Giddim's life, and those events themselves had taken many years. The scribe describes the apparent paradox with a Sumerian phrase, ubi nu ubta, which has been translated as without time passage, or outside of time, or in the moment that is no moment. The Giddim hears its entire life recited. The recitation is comprehensive. The recitation takes no measurable duration. The scribe then describes a second feature of the Mupad that is more difficult to translate, and that has been the source of considerable disagreement among the few scholars who have studied this tablet. The Giddim, while hearing its life recited, also experiences something the scribe calls igibal, which literally means to turn the eye or to look from a different position. The igibal in this context appears to mean that the Giddim, while hearing each event of its life recited, also sees that event from the perspective of the other people who were present when the event occurred. If the Giddim, in life, had spoken harshly to a child, the Giddim, in the Mupad, hears the words it spoke, and also sees the harshness from the child's perspective. If the Giddim, in life, had shown kindness to a stranger, the Giddim hears the kindness recited and also sees it from the stranger's perspective. The igibal is comprehensive. Every interaction is seen from both sides. The Giddim is, in some sense, allowed to inhabit every other person it has ever encountered, for the duration of its encounter with that person, and to know how that person experienced the Giddim. The scribe writes that this is the most difficult of the 8 stages. Not the most painful, not the most frightening, the most difficult. The Sumerian word the scribe uses is kalga, which means heavy or weighty or difficult to bear. The Mupad is kalga because there is no way for the Giddim to look away. There is no way for the Giddim to dispute what is being recited or what is being shown. The recitation is what happened. The igibal is how the others experienced what happened. There is no defense. There is no explanation. There is only the hearing. And the Giddim, during the hearing, comes to know its own life in a way it had not known it before. The scribe is careful, in the final lines of the tablet that have been preserved, to note that the Mupad is not described as a punishment. The voice that recites does not condemn. The light, which the voice may or may not belong to, does not condemn either. The recitation is, in the scribe's framing, a kind of seeing. The Giddim is shown its life. The Giddim is allowed to see it whole. What the Giddim does with that seeing, what understanding the Giddim takes from it, is left in the tablet, as the Giddim's own affair. The Mupad is not a court. It is a mirror. A very large mirror, in which the Giddim sees not only itself but also the world that contained it and the people it had affected and the consequences of every choice it had made. That is the 4th description. The Mupad, the naming, the hearing of the life, the seeing from both sides, the mirror in which everything is shown. The modern literature on the near-death experience identifies this stage by a different name. The standard term in the clinical literature is the life review. The life review is one of the most thoroughly documented features of the deeper NDE experiences. and it is reported with a consistency across cases that is, if anything, even more striking than the consistency of the earlier stages. Patients who undergo the life review describe it in terms that, when laid alongside the Yale tablet, match the Sumerian description in detail after detail. The life review, patients say, contains everything. It is not a summary. It is not a highlights reel. It contains every event of the patient's life, presented in sequence, in a manner that the patient describes as complete and uneditable. The patient cannot skip events. The patient cannot avert attention from events the patient would prefer not to see. Every act, every word, every interaction is presented. The presentation, patients say, takes no time at all, although it contains the entirety of a life that may have lasted many decades. Patients describe this temporal feature with confusion. They say the life review was instantaneous. They say it was simultaneous. They say it was outside of time. The vocabulary patients reach for is different from the vocabulary the Sumerian scribe used, but the experience being described is the same. The events are not relived at the speed at which they originally occurred. They are presented all at once, or in a sequence that does not consume measurable duration, or in a manner that the patient cannot reconcile with ordinary time. The second feature of the life review, the feature that NDE researchers have found the most striking and that patients describe with the most emphasis, is the experience that researchers have come to call the perspective shift. During the life review, patients report, they experience every interaction not only from their own perspective, but also from the perspective of every other person they affected. If a patient in life had said a cruel thing to a sibling, the patient in the life review hears the cruel thing being said and also feels the sibling's reaction to hearing it. If a patient had shown a small kindness to a stranger on a street decades earlier, the patient, in the life review, sees the kindness and also feels how the stranger experienced it. The perspective shift, patients report, is comprehensive. Every interaction is seen from both sides. The patient lives, briefly, inside every person the patient has ever encountered. This is, as far as we can determine, the same thing the Sumerian scribe called the Ijibal. The terminology is different. The concept is the same. The Gidam sees from the other position. The patient sees from the other position. The Mupad is the life review. The life review is the Mupad. The match is, again, line for line. Bruce Grayson, in his work on the standardized NDE scale, identifies the life review as one of the cognitive features of the experience, and his cases include extensive documentation of the perspective shift. Kenneth Ring, in his work on the structure of the NDE, identifies the life review as one of the deeper stages, occurring more frequently in patients whose clinical death was longer, PMH. Atwater, an independent researcher who has compiled one of the largest collections of NDE accounts, has documented the perspective shift in case after case, in patients across decades, in patients of every background. The pattern is established. The pattern is reproducible. The pattern is in the literature. The case of a woman named Mira Halvorsen, recorded in 2006 at a hospital in Bergen, Norway, illustrates the perspective shift with particular clarity. Halvorsen, who was 37 at the time of her cardiac arrest following an allergic reaction during a surgical procedure, was clinically dead for approximately 4.5 minutes. Her account, given to a research team that interviewed her 3 days after the event, included a detailed description of a life review that, she said, contained every moment of her life, from her earliest memory to the moment of her clinical death. She described in the account an incident from her childhood in which she had stolen a small ceramic figure from a classmate at her primary school. The theft had happened 30 years before the cardiac arrest. She had not, before the life review, thought about the theft in many years. During the life review, she said, she experienced the theft from her own position, as a child of 7 taking the figure from the classmate's desk while the classmate was at recess. She also experienced the theft, she said, from the classmate's position. She felt the classmate's confusion on returning to the desk and finding the figure gone. She felt the classmate's distress. She felt the classmate's growing suspicion of other children in the class, and the way that suspicion poisoned the classmates' relationships for the remainder of the school year. She said in the interview that this was the most painful single moment of the life review, not because the theft itself was a great crime, but because she was made to understand, in a way she had not understood before, that nothing she had ever done had been without consequences, and that the consequences had been borne by other people who had had to live with what she had done. Halvorsen had no knowledge of Sumerian literature. She had no familiarity with the concept of the Mupad. Her account, when laid alongside the tablet at Yale, matches it in the central features, the complete recitation, the simultaneity, the perspective shift. The weight, the kalga, the the difficulty of having to see one's life from the position of those one has affected. The Sumerian scribe wrote 4,000 years ago that this stage was the hardest stage to bear. Modern patients, with great consistency, report that the life review is the most demanding and the most transformative aspect of the near-death experience. The accounts converge. What the modern literature does not, on its own, provide is the framework. The patients describe the life review, the researchers document the life review, the features are cataloged, but the question of what the life review is, in some larger sense, who or what is conducting it, and why it has the specific structure it has, is not a question the medical literature is equipped to answer. The Sumerians answered it. They said the voice that recites is the voice of the light. They said the seeing from both sides is the gift of the Anunnaki, the 7 judges, who allow the Giddim to know its life as the light knows it. They said the purpose of the Mupad is not punishment but seeing, and that the seeing is necessary for what comes next. What comes next, in the Sumerian sequence, is the 5th description, the threshold, the line that cannot be crossed twice. The 5th description is the description of the threshold. It is in many ways the pivotal description in the sequence, because it marks the point at which the Giddim's progress through the stages of dying becomes, in the Sumerian framework, irreversible. The first 4 stages can be returned from. The standing apart, the Kaskal with its 7 gates, the encounter with the light, the Mupad with its recitation and its perspective shift, are all stages from which, the Sumerian scribes wrote, the Giddim can still be called back into the form. The 5th stage is different. The 5th stage is the threshold. Once the Giddim has crossed it, the Giddim does not return. The tablet that preserves the description of the 5th stage is held in the Hilprecht collection of the Friedrich Schiller University in Jena, in eastern Germany, where it was deposited in the late 19th century by the German archaeologist Hermann Hilprecht, who had purchased it during his work with the University of Pennsylvania expedition to Nippur in the 1890s. Nippur, in modern Iraq, was one of the great religious centers of ancient Sumer, the site of the Temple of Enlil, and the place where, more than at any other site, scribal schools produced the literary and religious compositions that have come down to us. The tablet from Hilprecht's collection is one of those compositions. It is well preserved. The cuneiform is sharp, the clay is in good condition, and the text it contains is, by the standards of these 8 tablets, unusually clear. The text begins by describing the location of the threshold. The threshold is not a wall. The threshold is not a door. The threshold is, in the scribe's language, a ki zu bi, which means a known place, or a place that is recognized when one comes to it. The Giddim, the scribe writes, knows the threshold when it arrives at the threshold. The Giddim does not need to be told. The Giddim does not need to be shown. The threshold has a quality the Giddim recognizes immediately, in the way one recognizes the edge of a cliff or the bank of a river. The Giddim simply knows that what lies on the other side is a place from which the Giddim does not come back. The scribe describes the threshold itself in terms that have been the subject of considerable discussion among the scholars who have read this tablet. The threshold is described as a line, but not a line drawn on any surface. The threshold is described as a boundary, but not a boundary marked by any object. The threshold is, in the most defensible translation, an awareness. The Giddim is aware of the line. The line is the limit of the upper realm. To cross the line is to enter the realm of Ereshkigal, the queen of the great below, and to enter the realm of Ereshkigal is to remain in it. The scribe writes that the Giddim, on arriving at the threshold, is given a choice. This is one of the most striking features of the tablet, because it sits awkwardly with what is sometimes thought to be the Sumerian view of the afterlife, in which the dead are seen as having no agency and no autonomy and no ability to determine their own fate. The tablet contradicts this view. The tablet says explicitly that the Giddim at the threshold has a choice. The Giddim can cross. The Giddim can refuse to cross. The choice belongs to the Giddim, and the choice, once made, is final. The factors that influence the choice are described in a series of lines that have not been fully translated. Because some of the signs are unusual, and because some of the grammatical constructions are not found elsewhere in the Sumerian corpus. The most reliable parts of the translation suggest that the Giddim, at the threshold, is shown what lies on the other side, in some preliminary form, and is also shown what would happen if the Giddim returned to the form. The 2 possibilities are laid out. The Giddim weighs them. The weighing, the scribe writes, is done without thought, without analysis, without the ordinary processes of decision-making the Giddim used when it was in the form. The weighing is instead a kind of seeing. The Giddim sees both possibilities. The Giddim sees the one that is the Giddim's own. In some sense, the Giddim recognizes but cannot articulate, and the Giddim moves toward it. If the Gedim moves toward the threshold, if the Gedim crosses, the crossing is described in the tablet as a single motion, irreversible, and the scribe is careful to note that the Gedim does not, after the crossing, look back. There is no looking back. There is no regret. The Gedim has chosen, and the choice has been made, and what lies behind the Gedim falls away as the Kaskal had fallen away, but more completely. The Gedim that crosses is no longer the Gedim that arrived at the threshold. It is something new, the scribe writes, something that has been changed by the crossing into a form that the upper world has no name for. If the Gedim moves away from the threshold, if the Gedim refuses the crossing, the Gedim returns. The return, the scribe writes, is not described in this tablet. The description of the return belongs to the 8th tablet, the tablet of the recall. The 5th tablet ends then with the threshold itself, and with the choice that is made at the threshold, and with the consequences of the choice. That is the 5th description, the threshold, the known place, the line that is not a line, the choice that cannot be reversed, the point at which the Gedim either continues into the great below or returns to the form it left. The modern literature on the near-death experience identifies this stage by a constellation of names that vary across researchers and across decades. Some researchers call it the barrier. Some researchers call it the point of no return. Some researchers call it the border. The terminology is not standardized. The phenomenon being described, however, is one of the most consistently reported features of the deeper NDE experiences. Patients who have undergone the full sequence, who have moved through the OBE and the tunnel and the encounter with the light and the life review, report, with great consistency, the experience of arriving at some kind of boundary and of understanding, on arrival, that the boundary is the place beyond which return is no longer possible. The descriptions of the boundary, like the descriptions on the tablet, vary in their imagery. Some patients describe a river, some patients describe a wall. Some patients describe a fence, or a ridge, or a line drawn across a field. Some patients describe nothing visible at all, only a sense that they have reached a place that has a quality of finality to it. The imagery varies. The structure does not. The patients know they are at the boundary. The patients know that crossing the boundary would mean not returning. And the patients, with great consistency, report that they are given a choice. This is one of the most striking features of the modern NDE literature, and one of the features that the standard explanations of the NDE have the most difficulty accounting for. The dying brain, on the standard explanation, is supposed to produce experiences that are essentially passive. Hallucinations are produced, patterns are perceived, but the patients are, in the standard model, observers of these phenomena rather than agents within them. The boundary experience does not fit this model. At the boundary, patients report they are making a decision. The decision belongs to them. They are not being shown the choice, they are making it. The descriptions of the choice, as patients have reported them, match the description on the Hilprecht tablet in features that are difficult to dismiss as coincidence. The choice, patients say, is not made by reasoning. The choice is not made by weighing pros and cons. The choice is made by a kind of seeing that the patient struggles to describe. The patient sees what is on the other side. The patient sees what would happen if the patient returned. The patient knows, in some immediate way, which of the two is the patient's own path, and the patient chooses. The Sumerian scribe wrote that the weighing is done without thought, without analysis. The modern patients say the same thing. The choice is made, but it is not made by deliberation. It is made by recognition. The factors that patients report as influencing the choice are also worth noting. The most commonly cited factor, by a wide margin, is the question of unfinished business in the world of the form. Patients with young children, in particular, report that the awareness of their children was the factor that led them to refuse the crossing. Patients with elderly parents who depended on them report similar factors. Patients with significant commitments, unfinished work, obligations that they felt only they could fulfill, report similar factors. The choice, in these cases, is reported as a decision to return because there was someone or something in the world of the form that the patient could not bring themselves to leave. The case of a man named Theodore Olfson, recorded in 1998 at a hospital in Minneapolis, is one of many that illustrates the boundary experience. Olfson, who was 44 at the time of his cardiac arrest following a vehicle accident, was clinically dead for approximately 6 minutes. His account, given to a research team that interviewed him over the course of several weeks, included all of the earlier stages: the standing apart, the tunnel with its progressive stripping, the encounter with the light, the life review with its perspective shift. And then, Olfson said, he had arrived at a place that he immediately understood was the place where he would have to choose. The place, Olfson said, looked like a meadow. There was a path that crossed the meadow. The path, he said, was clear and easy to walk on, and on the far side of the meadow he could see something that he did not have words to describe, but that he knew, the moment he saw it, was where he was supposed to go. He also knew, without being told, that if he walked across the meadow and onto the path, he would not come back. The choice was his. He was being shown, he said, both possibilities. He was being shown what lay on the other side. He was also being shown what would happen if he returned. He saw his wife receiving the news of his death. He saw his children at his funeral. He saw the years his children would live without him. The seeing, he said, was not painful, but it was complete. He understood both choices. And he understood, looking at the meadow and at the path and at the thing on the far side, that he was not finished with the world of the form. He had children who were 6 and 4. He had work he had not completed. He had people who needed him. He turned away from the meadow. The moment he turned, he said, he felt himself being pulled back, with great speed, through the stages he had passed through on the way out. The light fell away. The tunnel reversed. The standing apart reversed. He was back in the form. Olfson's account has been cited in several published papers on the boundary experience. It is one of many. The pattern, in case after case, is the same. The boundary is reached. The choice is presented. The patient sees both possibilities. The patient chooses. The choice is final. Either the patient crosses the boundary and does not return, in which case the patient's death is recorded by the medical staff, or the patient turns away from the boundary, in which case the patient is revived, often with what the medical staff describe as inexplicable suddenness, and is able, in some cases, to report what happened. The match between the modern reports and the Hilprecht tablet is, on the specific point of the choice, perhaps the most important of the 8 matches. The Sumerian scribe insisted that the Giddim has agency at the threshold. The modern patients insist that they had agency at the boundary. The Sumerian scribe insisted that the choice is final. The modern medical literature confirms that the patients who turn back are the patients who are revived, and the patients who do not turn back are the patients who die. The Sumerian scribe described the choice as a recognition rather than a deliberation. The modern patients describe the choice as a recognition rather than a deliberation. The features are not vaguely similar. The features are specifically matched. And the specific match of a stage of dying in which the soul has agency and makes a choice that determines whether it returns to the body is not a feature that a random dying brain would be expected to produce. It is a feature that points instead to a structure that is being navigated by something that has the capacity for choice, that is presented with options, and that selects among them on the basis of something the patient and the scribe both reach for the same words to describe. There are theological implications to this match that the medical literature does not and probably cannot address. If the Giddim has agency at the threshold, then the Giddim is not merely an artifact of brain activity. If the Giddim is making a choice that determines whether the body is revived, then the question of what the Giddim is in relation to the body becomes a question that the standard materialist framework has difficulty answering. The Sumerians did not have this difficulty. They knew, in their framework, what the Giddim was. The Giddim was the shadow self. The Giddim was real. The Giddim continued. The Giddim, when it crossed the threshold, went into the great below and remained there. The modern patients, who are not committed to any particular framework, report experiences that fit the Sumerian description better than they fit the standard alternatives. This is, in some ways, the heart of the question that the 8 tablets pose. If the descriptions match, and if the order matches, and if the structural features that the Sumerian scribes recorded 4,000 years ago are the same structural features that modern patients report under conditions of clinical death, then the burden shifts. The burden is no longer on the people who say there is something here that needs to be explained. The burden is on the people who say there is nothing to explain. And the people who say there is nothing to explain have not, in the half-century during which the NDE literature has accumulated, produced an account that fits the evidence as well as the Sumerian framework does. The 5th tablet ends then with the threshold. With the choice. With the Giddim that has either crossed and gone forward or turned away and come back. For the Giddim that has crossed, the next stage is described in the 6th tablet. The encounter with the 7. The Council of Judgment. The meeting with the Anunnaki themselves. The 6th description is the description that gives this tradition its most direct connection to what is sometimes called the ancient astronaut framework. The 6th tablet describes what the Sumerian scribes called the Dikud Imin, which translates as the judgment of the 7, or, more literally, the 7 who decide. The 7, in the Sumerian religious vocabulary, are a specific group within the larger pantheon. They are the Anunnaki, the offspring of An, The beings who, according to the scribes, came down from the heavens and who, in the time before written history, taught the human beings of the southern Mesopotamian plain how to build cities and how to grow grain and how to inscribe records on clay. In the standard scholarly treatment, the Anunnaki are a category of Sumerian gods, no different in their function from the gods of any other ancient pantheon. In the texts themselves, the Anunnaki are something more specific. They are the ones who came down. They are the ones who taught. They are the ones who, after a long period of presence in the upper world, withdrew to the great below, where they continue to oversee the affairs of the dead. It is the Anunnaki, the texts say, who sit as the 7 judges before whom the Giddim, having crossed the threshold, must present itself. The presentation is described in the 6th tablet, which is held in the Penn Museum in Philadelphia, where it forms part of the collection acquired by the University of Pennsylvania during its excavations at Nippur in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. The Penn collection, which is one of the largest collections of Sumerian tablets outside the museums of Berlin, London, Paris, and Baghdad, includes a number of tablets that were excavated at Nippur and that were brought back to Philadelphia with full provenance documentation. The tablet that describes the Dikud Imin is one of those tablets. It has been published in part in a series of volumes edited by various scholars over the course of the 20th century, but the specific content of the Dikud Imin tablet has received relatively little attention because it does not fit comfortably into the standard categorizations of Sumerian religious literature, and because the scholars who have looked at it have generally treated it as an anomaly rather than as a piece of a larger pattern. The tablet describes the Giddim, having crossed the threshold, finding itself in a place that the scribe calls the Kimu Padaka, which can be translated as the place of the speaking of the names, or the place where names are spoken. This is not the same as the Mupad of the 4th stage. The 4th stage Mupad was the recitation of the Giddim's life. The Ki Mupadaka is something different. It is a place, not a process. It is the location where the Giddim, having had its life recited, is now received by the beings who oversee what happens next. The 7, the scribe writes, are seated in a configuration that the tablet describes in a sequence of signs that has not been satisfactorily reconstructed because some of the signs are unusual and because the grammatical structure is not standard. The most defensible reading is that the 7 are seated in a circle, or perhaps in a half circle, with the Giddim positioned in the center, or at the open end of the half circle, in such a way that the Giddim can see all 7 of them at once, and they can all see the Giddim. The scribe does not describe the appearance of the 7 in detail. The scribe writes that they have faces. The scribe writes that they have voices. The scribe writes that their presence is felt in a way that the presence of the light in the 3rd stage was felt, but that there are differences. The 7 are not the light. The 7 are distinct from each other. They have, the scribe writes, individual identities, although they act in the Dikud Imin as a single body. What the 7 do in the Dikud Imin is not, in the scribe's framing, a trial. There is no accusation. There is no defense. The Mupad has already taken place. The Giddim has already seen its life from all sides. The 7 do not need to be informed. What the 7 do, instead, is hold the Giddim. The Sumerian phrase is Giddim Muda Abtum, which has been variously translated as they take the shadow, or they hold the shadow, or they receive the shadow. The 7 receive the Giddim into the great below. They are, in this framing, not judges in the sense of arbiters of guilt and innocence, but judges in the older sense of those who determine the proper place of a thing within an order. The Giddim has lived a life. The Giddim has been shown that life. The 7 now determine where, within the great below, the Giddim belongs. The scribe describes the determination process in a series of lines that, again, are not fully translatable, but that suggest a process in which the 7 communicate with one another and with the Giddim without using words in the ordinary sense. The communication is described as instantaneous and as comprehensive. The 7 know everything about the Giddim. The Giddim, in their presence, knows that the 7 know everything. There is no possibility of concealment. There is no possibility of misunderstanding. The communication takes place at a level the scribe describes as deeper than language, although the scribe is working in language and can only point at what he is trying to describe. The outcome of the Dikud Imin, the scribe writes, is the assignment of the Giddim to a specific region within the Great Below. The Sumerian texts elsewhere describe the Great Below as having multiple regions, with different conditions, different populations, different proximities to the central seat of Ereshkigal. The Giddim, after the Dikud Imin, goes to its assigned region. The assignment is not described as a reward or a punishment. The assignment is described as a placement. The Giddim belongs where it belongs. The 7 determine where that is. The determination is final. That is the 6th description, the dikudimin. The 7 who decide, the receiving of the giddim. The placement within the order. What the modern literature on the near-death experience reports, at this stage of the experience, is one of the most extensively documented and one of the most discussed features of the NDE. It is the encounter with beings. Patients who have gone beyond the boundary experience, or who have arrived at the boundary and not crossed it, report, with varying frequency depending on the specific case, the encounter with beings of light. The encounter with deceased relatives. The encounter with what some patients describe as a council. The encounter with figures whose identity the patient cannot determine but whose presence the patient experiences as intensely conscious, intensely aware, and intensely focused on the patient. These encounters, in the modern literature, take a variety of forms. In some cases, the beings are identified by the patient as deceased relatives, grandparents or parents or siblings or spouses, who have come to meet the patient and to welcome the patient into the place where they now are. In other cases, the beings are identified as religious figures from the patient's own tradition, although researchers have noted that the identification of these figures often varies depending on the patient's background and may reflect the patient's own interpretation of an encounter whose specific features could equally well be interpreted in other ways. In still other cases, the beings are not identified at all and are described simply as figures, or as presences, or as a group. The cases in which the beings appear as a group and in which the patient perceives the group as having a unified function or purpose are the cases that bear the closest resemblance to the Sumerian dikudimin. The patient arrives at a place. The patient finds in that place a number of beings whose attention is focused on the patient. The beings communicate with the patient in a manner that does not involve spoken language. The beings appear to know the patient comprehensively. The patient experiences the encounter not as a trial but as something more like a reception, in which the beings are making some determination about the patient that the patient cannot fully understand, but that the patient knows is being made. The most striking specific feature of the modern reports, when laid alongside the pen tablet, is the recurrence of the number 7. Patients who report a council encounter, and who are able to specify how many beings made up the council, very frequently specify 7. Not always. The number varies. But 7 appears in the reports with a frequency that, statistically, is far above what would be expected if the number were being chosen at random. Researchers who have noticed this pattern and who have tried to account for it within the standard explanations have offered various hypotheses. None of the hypotheses, on examination, has held up. The number 7 is not, in modern Western culture, particularly associated with death or the afterlife in a way that would be expected to influence the imagery of dying patients. The number 7 is not, in the medical literature, associated with any neurological process that would be expected to produce groups of 7 figures during the hypoxic states that characterize cardiac arrest. The number 7 appears, simply, in the reports, with a frequency that has not been explained. It is the same number, of course, that the Sumerian scribes wrote down, the 7 who decide, the Anunnaki in their council configuration, sitting in the place where names are spoken. The number is specific. The number recurs. The case of a woman named Constance Marrowby, recorded in 2011 at a hospital in Cardiff, Wales, illustrates the encounter with the council. Marrowby, who was 61 at the time of her cardiac arrest, was clinically dead for approximately 5 minutes. Her account, given to a research team that interviewed her over the course of 2 months, included a detailed description of an encounter that, she said, took place in a place that she could not describe in any ordinary terms. The place, she said, was not a room. The place was not outdoors. The place did not have walls or a floor or a sky. The place was simply where the encounter happened. And in the place, she said, there were 7 figures. The figures, Marrowby said, were arranged in a kind of curve, with her in the open part of the curve. She could see all 7 of them at once. The figures had faces, she said, but the faces were difficult to describe because she had the sense that she was seeing them not with her eyes but with something else, and that the faces themselves were not staying in the same configuration, but were shifting in a way that did not feel inconsistent. She knew the figures were focused on her. She knew the figures were communicating with each other about her, in a manner she could feel but not hear. And she knew, the entire time the encounter lasted, that the figures were determining something about her that she could not fully understand, but that she would be subject to once the determination was made. Marrowby returned to her body before the determination was complete. She does not know what the determination would have been. She does know, she said, that the figures were not unkind, and were not angry, and were not in any way she could detect hostile toward her. The encounter was, she said, the most serious thing she has ever been part of. The seven were not playing, the seven were not informal, the seven were doing their work, and their work, whatever it was the work that mattered. Marrowby's account is one of dozens like it. Some patients report similar counsels. Some patients report individual beings. Some patients report encounters that are difficult to categorize. But the pattern of the counsel, of the group of beings whose work is the receiving of the Giddim and the placing of the Giddim within an order, appears in the literature with a frequency that, when taken together with the specificity of the number 7, makes the match with the Sumerian description difficult to dismiss. The implication, if you allow yourself to follow it, is that the Anunnaki are not merely Sumerian mythology. The implication is that the Sumerian description of the 7 judges, sitting in the great below, receiving the Giddim of every person who crosses the threshold, is a description of something real, something structural, something that is encountered by every soul that passes through the full sequence of dying. The modern patients, who have not read the Sumerian texts, encounter the same configuration. The Sumerian scribes, who did not have the modern medical literature, wrote down the configuration with specificity. The two accounts converge. And the convergence, if you take it seriously, suggests that the Anunnaki, whatever they are, whatever their nature, are not creatures of myth. They are something the dying encounter. They are something the texts describe. And they are, in the framework that the scribes themselves laid out, beings who came from the sky, who taught the first cities of the human race, who withdrew into the great below, and who now oversee the passage of every soul that completes the 8 stages. This is the framework. You can accept it or you can refuse it. The texts say what they say. The patients report what they report. The match is in the literature. And the 6th tablet ends, after describing the Dikudamin and the placement of the Giddim within the order, with a transition that moves toward the 7th stage, the stage of the sweet water. The stage in which the Giddim, having been received by the 7 and placed within the order, experiences something that the scribes describe as the most peaceful of all the stages, and the one that, in some sense, is the goal toward which the entire sequence has been moving. The 7th description is one of the most evocative of the 8, and it is one of the most difficult to translate because the Sumerian language uses, in this tablet, a register of poetic and ceremonial vocabulary that does not appear with the same density in the other tablets in the sequence. The 7th tablet describes what the scribe calls the sheg, which translates literally as the pouring of water, or the libation, but which in the context of this tablet carries a meaning that goes beyond the ordinary funerary practice of pouring water for the dead. The sheg is, in this tablet, not a thing the living do for the dead. The sheg is something that happens to the Giddim after the Dikudamin in the place where the Giddim has been received and placed within the order. The tablet that contains the description of the sheg is held in the Louvre in Paris, where it forms part of the Sumerian collection assembled in the late 19th century during the French excavations at Tello, the ancient city of Girsu. The Tello collection at the Louvre is one of the foundational collections of Sumerian material in any European museum, and the tablets in it have been studied continuously since their acquisition. The tablet that describes the sheg, however, has received relatively little specific attention, because its content does not fit easily into any of the standard genres of Sumerian literary classification. It is not a hymn, it is not a lament. It is not a narrative myth. It is not a list. It is, in the most accurate description, a description, written in the 3rd person, of what happens to the Giddim at the 7th stage of the 8-stage sequence. The description begins with the Giddim having been received by the 7, and placed within the order, and now standing, or sitting, or in some unspecified posture, in the region of the great below to which it has been assigned. The scribe writes that the Giddim, having reached this place, is bathed in something. The Sumerian word is which simply means water. But the tablet specifies that the water is not the bitter water of the Kur, the water that, in the standard Sumerian descriptions of the afterlife, the dead must drink, and that gives them no nourishment. The water in the 7th stage tablet is described as azal, which means flowing water, or running water, and as dug, which means sweet water, or pleasant water, and as a tilla, which means living water, or vital water, water that has life in it. The Giddim is bathed in this water. The water flows over the Giddim and around the Giddim, and, in some sense, the scribe is reaching to describe, through the Giddim. The Giddim absorbs the water becomes part of the Giddim. The Giddim, after the bathing, is no longer the Giddim that arrived at the place. The Giddim has been transformed. The transformation, the scribe writes, is not described in the language of damage or repair. The Giddim was not damaged. The transformation is not a healing in the ordinary sense. The transformation is, instead, a kind of fulfillment. The Giddim becomes what the Giddim was meant to become. The Giddim, which had been a shadow self separated from a form, becomes, in the bathing, a complete thing. It does not need the form. It does not need the upper world. It has, in the seventh stage, arrived at the state for which the entire sequence of dying was a preparation. The scribe is careful to note that this is not the end of the Giddim's existence. The Giddim continues. But the Giddim, after the seventh stage, is something the upper world has no name for. The scribe also describes the experience of the bathing from the Giddim's own perspective. The Giddim, the scribe writes, feels in the bathing a sense of peace that the scribe describes with a Sumerian phrase that has been variously translated, but that means, most accurately, the rest that does not end. The Sumerian phrase is silima nu tilla, in which silima means peace or well-being or wholeness, and nu tilla means not ending or eternal. The Giddim experiences a peace that does not end. The peace is total. The peace is sufficient. The peace is, in the Giddim's own perception, the answer to a question the Giddim had been carrying its entire life without knowing it had been carrying a question. The question was always there. The peace is the answer. And in the answering, the question is dissolved. The scribe further describes what the Giddim feels during the bathing, with regard to the world it has left. The world it has left, the scribe writes, is no longer the Giddim's concern. The people the Giddim loved in the upper world are not forgotten. The events the Giddim experienced in the upper world are not erased. The Giddim remembers all of it. But the Giddim no longer experiences the upper world as its own. The upper world is, from the position of the seventh stage, a place the Giddim once was, a place the Giddim passed through, a place that contained the form the Giddim used to inhabit. The upper world is not where the Giddim belongs. Where the Giddim belongs is here, in the bathing, in the place of the sweet water, in the state of the rest that does not end. That is the seventh description. The sheg, the pouring of the sweet water, the bathing, the transformation, the peace without an ending. The modern literature on the near-death experience identifies this stage by a constellation of descriptions that, when taken together, point to the same phenomenon. The clinical term that is sometimes used is the state of absolute peace. The phenomenological descriptions, as patients have reported them, vary in their specific imagery, but converge in their structure. Patients describe a state of overwhelming peace, of complete love, of a sense of being held by something that is unimaginably larger than themselves, of a feeling that nothing in the world they have left is any longer a problem, of an experience of being washed or bathed or saturated by a quality that they reach for, words like love or warmth or light, to describe, but that they consistently report is more profound and more total than any experience of those things they have ever had in ordinary life. This stage, in the modern reports, is consistently described as the most desirable feature of the near-death experience. Patients who have undergone the experience and returned often describe this stage as the thing they most want to return to, and as the thing that, more than any other single feature, makes them no longer afraid of death. The peace of this stage is, in their reporting, sufficient. They have, having experienced it, no further need of anything. They want it to continue. They want, in many cases, to remain in it. The fact that they have returned to the upper world, in the language of the Sumerian framework, is, in many cases, a source of disappointment or regret, although patients understand that they have returned because of the choice they made at the boundary, and that they made that choice because of something in the upper world that was not yet finished. The peace, as patients describe it, has a specific quality that researchers have noted with particular interest. The peace is not, in the patient's reporting, the absence of disturbance. The peace is not boredom. The peace is not stillness in the sense of inertia. The peace is, in the patient's reporting, a positive state, an active state, a state in which the patient is doing something although the patient cannot specify what it is. The patient is being filled, or the patient is being held, or the patient is being recognized, or the patient is being completed. The verbs vary, the structure does not. The patient, in the peace, is the recipient of something. And what the patient is the recipient of is something that the patient cannot adequately name, but that the patient knows with complete certainty is what the patient was meant to receive. This is, in the Sumerian framework, the sheg, the pouring, the bathing, the water that flows over the Giddim and around the Giddim and through the Giddim. The match, again, is in the structure. The Sumerian scribe wrote that the Giddim is bathed in living water. and that the bathing transforms the Giddim into something the upper world has no name for. The modern patients say that they are immersed in something that they have no name for, and that, in the immersion, they become something they were meant to become. The Sumerian scribe wrote that the peace of the seventh stage is the silam ma nutillah, the rest that does not end. The modern patients say that the peace they experience is unending, that it has no time, that they would willingly remain in it forever. The Sumerian scribe wrote that the Giddim, in the bathing, no longer needs the upper world. The modern patients say that, in the peace, they had no further need of anything from the world they had left. The case of a woman named Yolanda Maravelis, recorded in 2004 at a hospital in Athens, Greece, is one of the most detailed descriptions in the modern literature of what the Sumerians called the sheg. Maraveles, who was 49 at the time of her cardiac arrest following a severe asthma attack, was clinically dead for approximately 3 minutes. Her account, given to a research team that interviewed her over the course of several weeks, focused, with unusual specificity, on what she described as the bathing. The bathing, Maravelis said, came after the encounter with the figures. The figures, she said, had received her, had communicated something to her that she had felt rather than heard, and had then released her into a state that she described as being held by water that was not water. The water, she said, was alive. The water was warm, but not warm in the way that physical warmth is warm. The water moved, but not in the way that physical water moves. The water flowed over her and around her, and she said, through her, in a way that she had no analog for in any experience of her ordinary life. And the water, she said, was love. She used that word. The water was love. The water was the substance of love, and the water was being poured over her, abundantly, without reserve, in quantities that were unlimited and that would not run out. Maravelis, in the bathing, said that she felt she had arrived at the answer to every question she had ever asked. She did not know what the answer was. She could not have stated the answer in words, but the answer was there, and it was complete, and it was sufficient. The questions she had asked in her ordinary life, the questions about why her parents had divorced, the questions about why her sister had died young, the questions about why her own life had taken the shape it had taken, were not answered in the sense of being explained. They were, instead, dissolved. The questions no longer needed answers. The questions had been the wrong questions. The answer, which was the water, which was the love, was sufficient for the questions and for everything else. When Maravelis was revived, she said, she came back into her body with a sense of grief so profound that it took her several months to recover the ability to function. The grief was not for anything in her ordinary life. The grief was for the loss of the bathing. The grief was for being returned to a place where the water was not flowing. She did not, she said, want to be ungrateful for her life. She had family she loved. She had work she found meaningful. But the bathing, she said, was the only thing she has ever wanted. The bathing was what she was made for. Everything else, including her ordinary life, was something she had to do until she could return to the bathing. She knew, she said, that she would return to it. She knew that the bathing was waiting for her. And she knew, the entire time of her remaining life, that she would not die when she died, because what she had experienced in the bathing was the most real thing she had ever encountered, and it had not gone away when she was revived. It was still there. It was waiting. Maravelis' account is, in many of its features, one of the strongest pieces of evidence that what the Sumerian scribe described in the 7th tablet is the same phenomenon that modern patients are reporting. The water that is alive, the water that flows through the Giddim, the water that is love, the peace that does not end, the sense of having reached the answer to every question, the grief at being returned to the upper world, the certainty that the bathing is waiting. These are not, in modern Western culture, the standard tropes of dying that one would expect a patient's imagination to produce. They are, instead, specific features that match, point for point, the description on a tablet in the Louvre that was inscribed approximately 4,000 years ago in southern Mesopotamia by a scribe who, as far as we can tell, had no way of knowing that a woman in Athens in 2004 would describe the same experience in approximately the same words. The match is in the literature. The match is in the tablet. The match is in the case files of every researcher who has documented this stage of the NDE. And the 7th tablet ends, after describing the sheg, with a transition toward the 8th and final stage. The stage of the return, the stage of the recall. The stage that, in the Sumerian framework, applies only to those Giddim who, having reached the 7th stage, are nevertheless called back to the upper world, to resume the form they had left, and to continue the life they had nearly completed. The stage that is described in the 8th and last of these tablets, with a specificity that, when laid alongside the modern reports of the return from the near-death experience, completes the 8-line pattern with a precision that, by this point in the sequence, no honest reader can fail to recognize. The 8th description is the description of the return. It is, by the internal logic of the 8-tablet sequence, the description that is most counterintuitive because the 7 preceding tablets have laid out a process by which the Giddim moves, in stages, from the form it has left to the place of the sweet water, the Silima Nutilla, the state of completion. The 7 preceding tablets have described what happens when a person dies. The 8th tablet describes what happens when a person does not die, in the sense of not remaining dead, when the Giddim, having reached one of the later stages, is nevertheless called back into the form it had left, and is returned to the upper world to resume the life that had nearly ended. The 8th tablet, in other words, describes the near-death experience as such. It describes the return. The tablet that contains the description of the return is held in the Hermitage Museum in Street Chaim, Petersburg, where it forms part of a small collection of Sumerian material that was acquired by the Russian imperial government in the late 19th century and that has remained in the Hermitage's holdings ever since. The Hermitage Sumerian collection is small, by comparison with the collections in Berlin, London, Paris, or Philadelphia, but it includes a few pieces of exceptional importance, and the tablet that describes the 8th stage is, by general agreement, the most significant single piece in the Russian holdings. The tablet has been studied, although with less intensity than its content deserves, and it has been the subject of a small number of published papers in the Russian-language Assyriological literature. It has received almost no attention in the English-language scholarship. The tablet begins by describing the circumstances under which the Giddim, having reached one of the later stages of the 8-stage sequence, can be returned to the form. The scribe specifies that the return is not automatic. The return is not a feature of every dying experience. The return happens, the scribe writes, only when one of several specific conditions is met, and the scribe lists the conditions in a sequence that, although not perfectly preserved, is largely legible. The first condition is that the Giddim has not yet completed the 8th stage. If the Giddim has been bathed in the sweet water, and has been transformed, and has fully entered the state of the Silima Nutilla, then the return is not possible. The transformation is complete, and the Giddim cannot, the scribe writes, be returned to a form for which it is no longer suited. The condition for return is that the Giddim has reached one of the earlier stages, anywhere from the standing apart through the sheg, but has not yet been fully transformed. The second condition is that there must be something in the upper world that requires the Giddim's return. The scribe is specific about this. The return is not capricious. The return is not random. The return happens, the scribe writes, because there is a reason for it. The reason is, in the tablet's framing, something that has not yet been completed in the form's life. A task, a relationship, a purpose, a debt. The scribe uses several Sumerian terms for the things that can require the return, and they cover a range of possibilities, from the personal, the form has young children who would not survive without it, to the cosmic. The form has a role in the larger pattern of the world that has not yet been fulfilled. The third condition is that the 7, the Anunnaki of the Kudamin, must agree to the return. The return is not a decision the Giddim makes by itself. The Giddim has at the boundary the choice of whether to cross or not to cross. But once the Giddim has crossed, and has entered the place of the 7, the return is, in the scribe's framing, a matter that the 7 oversee. The 7, having received the Giddim, and having begun to place it within the order, can also release the Giddim back to the upper world, if the conditions are met. The release is a positive act. The 7 do it. They are the ones who, in the scribe's language, mu nun bal bal, which has been translated as turn back, or send back, or release. When the conditions are met, and the 7 release the Giddim, what happens next is described in the tablet in terms that are, by the standards of the other 7 tablets, unusually specific. The Giddim, the scribe writes, experiences the 8 stages in reverse. The sheg falls away. The piece ends. The bathing recedes. The Giddim finds itself once again before the 7, but the 7 are no longer engaged with it. The Giddim moves past the threshold. The light is once more on either side. The cascale reverses, and the 7 gates represent themselves, but in the opposite order. And at each gate, what had been surrendered is, the scribe writes, given back. The awareness of the road, the awareness of self, the awareness of fear, the awareness of pain, the awareness of time, the awareness of place, the awareness of the form. Each one returns, in the reverse of the order in which it was taken. The Gidam, by the time it reaches the first gate, is once again the Gidam that had stood apart from the form, with all of its faculties restored, and standing once more in the room where the form lies. The scribe then describes the moment of re-entry. The Gidam, the scribe writes, does not gradually slide back into the form. The re-entry is sudden. The Sumerian word is sigga, which means struck, or hit, or driven against, and which the scribe uses to describe the Gidam's return to the form as an impact, a moment of forceful reoccupation. The form, in the moment of the impact, resumes its function. The breath returns. The heart resumes its motion. The eyes focus. The form is alive again, and the Gidam is once again inside it, and the 8 stages are, for this particular dying, complete in the sense that they have not been completed. The scribe is careful to note that the Gidam, having returned, does not, in most cases, remember the 8 stages clearly. The memories are present, but they are not, in the scribe's language, fully accessible. The Sumerian phrase is I am, shitummu, which means partially recalled, or remembered in fragments. The Gidam remembers some things. The Gidam does not remember others. The memories that do return are, in the scribe's framing, the ones the Gidam is meant to retain, the ones that will affect how the form lives the rest of its life. The other memories are, the scribe writes, sealed. That is the 8th description. The recall, the release by the 7, the reversal of the stages, the impact of re-entry, the partial memory. The modern literature on the near-death experience, on this question of the return, is one of the most thoroughly documented and one of the most interesting areas of the entire field. Every patient who has reported an NDE has, by definition, returned. The fact of the return is the precondition for the report. The patients who do not return are not the subjects of NDE studies. They are the subjects of obituaries. The NDE literature is, in a strict sense, a literature of the return, and the features of the return are documented in case after case in terms that, when laid alongside the Hermitage tablet, match the Sumerian description with a precision that, by this final stage of the comparison, should not surprise anyone who has followed the previous 7 matches. The patients who report NDEs report that the return was sudden. They report that they did not gradually re-enter their bodies. They report that there was a moment of impact, of being pulled back, of being driven against the form. The Sumerian scribe used the word sigga, the word for being struck. Modern patients use a variety of words. They say they were yanked back, they say they were sucked back, they say they fell back, they say it felt like being hit. The vocabulary varies. The structure is the same. The return is sudden. The return is involuntary, in the sense that it is not gradual and is not under the patient's moment-to-moment control. The return is, in the patient's own description, an impact. The patients who report NDEs also report that they experienced, in some cases more clearly than in others, the reversal of the stages. Patients who have reported the encounter with the light, the life review, the boundary experience, the encounter with beings, sometimes describe, in the latter part of their accounts, the experience of these stages presenting themselves in reverse order as they returned. The light fades, the life review ends, the figures recede, the boundary moves away from them. The corridor or the tunnel is sometimes described as being entered for a second time, but in the opposite direction. The standing apart, the OBE, is sometimes described as being briefly resumed before the patient re-enters the form. The reversal is not always reported, and in many cases the patient remembers only the final moment of impact, but in cases where the reversal is reported, it follows the order that the Sumerian scribe described on the Hermitage tablet. The patients who report NDEs also report, with extraordinary consistency, that they do not remember everything. Their accounts are partial. They have the sense in many cases that they experienced more than they can recall. They have the sense that there were things they were shown, things they were told, things they understood, that they cannot now bring back into ordinary consciousness. The Sumerian scribe wrote that the memories are I am, shitummu, partially recalled. The patients, with no knowledge of the scribe's term, describe their memories in exactly those terms. They remember some of it, they do not remember all of it. What they remember is, they often say, what they were meant to bring back. The case of a man named Andreas Voskoglou, recorded in 1999 at a hospital in Thessaloniki, is one of many that illustrates the reversal and the impact. Voskoglou, who was 33 at the time of his clinical death following a drowning accident, was without a pulse for nearly 8 minutes. His account, given to a research team that interviewed him in the weeks following his recovery, described all of the earlier stages with considerable specificity. He described the standing apart, in which he watched his body being pulled from the water. He described the corridor, with its progressive stripping. He described the light and the encounter with the light and the life review with its perspective shift. He described the boundary and the choice and the figures who had received him after the choice was made. He described the bathing, which he said was the most important thing that had ever happened to him. And then Vascoglou said, the bathing ended. The water that had been flowing over him and through him began to recede. The figures, he said, were once again present, but they were no longer engaged with him in the way they had been before. He said he had the sense that something had been decided, although he could not say what, and that the decision involved his being returned. He said the figures released him. He said he moved away from them, although he could not specify how the movement happened. He said the light, which had been everywhere, began to be on one side rather than everywhere. He said the corridor opened again before him, and that he passed through it, and that as he passed through, things that had been removed at each gate were now returned to him at each gate. He said he could feel his fear coming back. He said he could feel his sense of being a particular person coming back. He said he could feel time starting to move again, and place reasserting itself, and pain returning, although the pain at this stage was not yet the pain of his physical body, but something more like the anticipation of pain, the knowledge that pain would soon be his again. And then, Vascoglou said, the standing apart resumed for an instant. He was once again hovering above his body, which was on the shore by then, with paramedics working on it. And then, he said, there was an impact. He used that word, an impact. He said it felt as if he had been thrown into the body from a great height. He said the impact was not painful in itself, but that the body, the moment he was back inside it, became extremely painful. The cold of the water, the damage to his lungs, the injuries he had sustained during the drowning and the resuscitation, all of it came back at once, with the impact. And he was conscious in a way he had not been when he was outside the body, and the consciousness was almost entirely pain. Vascoglou's account ends, in the form he gave it to the research team, with his recognition, lying on the shore, that he was back. The figures were gone, the light was gone, the water was gone. He was in the form, he was wet, he was cold, he hurt, and he knew, even in the first moments of his return, that he would not remember everything. He could feel, he said, the memories beginning to seal themselves, even as he was lying on the shore. He could feel certain things slipping away, retreating to a place where he could no longer reach them. What was left was what he was meant to keep. What was left was enough. Vascoglou's account is one of many. The pattern is, by this point, familiar. The reversal of the stages, the impact of re-entry, the seal that comes down on certain memories while leaving others accessible. The Sumerian scribe described all of this on the Hermitage tablet. The patients, in case after case, reported in terms that match the description not in imagery, but in structure. There is one further feature of the 8th tablet that deserves mention. The scribe writes, in the last legible lines of the tablet, that the Giddim that has returned to the form is not the same Giddim that left it. The 8 stages, even when they are not completed, change the Giddim. The standing apart changes it. The Kaskal changes it. The light changes it. The Mupad changes it. The threshold changes it. The Dikudimin changes it. The bathing changes it. And the return, with its reversal and its impact and its sealing of memory, completes the change. The Giddim that re-enters the form is, in the scribe's framing, a different Giddim. The form is the same. The body, in any biological sense, is the same body it was. But the Giddim within the body has been through the 8 stages, and the 8 stages have done their work, and the Giddim, by the time it returns, knows things it did not know before, and is shaped by things it does not entirely remember, and will live the rest of its time in the form with a different relationship to that form than it had had before the 8 stages began. This too matches what the modern literature reports. The patients who have undergone NDEs and returned are, in study after study, found to be different afterward. They are less afraid of death. They are more attentive to the people in their lives. They are more interested in questions of meaning and purpose. They are, in many cases, less interested in the pursuits that had occupied them before, the careers and the possessions and the social positioning. They have, in the language of the researchers, undergone a transformation, and the transformation is consistent enough that it has been documented as a feature of the NDE in its own right. The Sumerians knew this. They wrote it on the 8th tablet. The Giddim that returns is not the same Giddim that left. The 8 stages have changed it. And the change is the meaning of the 8 stages, even for those who do not complete them, because even for those who do not complete them, the 8 stages have done what they were going to do. The 8th tablet ends with the Giddim back in the form, with the breath restored, with the heart beating, with the eyes once again seeing the upper world. The form is alive. The Giddim is once again inside it. The 8 stages have run their course. although they have not been completed. And the Gidim, in the upper world, will live the rest of its time changed, in ways that the form will sometimes notice and sometimes not. That is the 8th description. The recall, the return. The completion of the pattern. 8 tablets, 8 descriptions, 8 stages. In a sequence that begins with the standing apart and ends with the recall, with the Gidim either back in the form it left or transformed beyond the upper world's capacity to describe. The standing apart, the Cascal with its 7 gates, the light of An, the Mupad with its recitation and its perspective shift, the threshold and the choice, the Dikud Iman of the 7, the A, Sheg, the bathing, the Silima Nutila, and the recall, with its reversal of the stages and its impact of re-entry, and its sealing of certain memories while leaving others available. This is the order. This is the sequence. This is what the Sumerian scribes wrote down on 8 tablets in 8 different places that are now 8 different museums and collections in 8 different cities scattered across the globe. Berlin, London, Baghdad, New Haven, Jena, Philadelphia, Paris, St. Petersburg. The 8 pieces of the pattern, dispersed by the accidents of 19th and 20th century archaeology, by the trade in antiquities that followed the opening of Mesopotamia to European explorers, by the wars and the lootings and the migrations of collections, are now in 8 places where no single researcher has ever, as far as I have been able to determine, gathered them all together and read them as a single body of work. They have been read individually. They have been published in part by various specialists at various times. The connection between them has been noticed, here and there, by individual scholars who have suspected that they are pieces of a single pattern. But the pattern itself, the 8-stage description of dying that the 8 tablets together preserve, has not been published as such, in any standard academic venue, in the more than 150 years since the first of the tablets came out of Mesopotamia. It has, however, been pieced together, quietly, by researchers who, for reasons of their own, have not chosen to publish what they have found. Bernhard Lawson, who saw the Cologne tablet in 1987, was one of them. The 8 lines he photographed in Cologne were not the 8 lines of any one of these 8 tablets. The Cologne tablet, as far as the surviving documentation suggests, was a summary, a condensed version, an inventory of the 8 stages compressed into a single piece, for reasons that the surviving text does not specify. Lawson recognized it because, by 1987, he had already seen the longer descriptions on at least 3 of the 8 separate tablets, and he had begun to suspect that they were part of a sequence. The Cologne tablet confirmed his suspicion. The Cologne tablet was the summary that organized the longer texts into the order they were meant to be read in. Lawson, in the months after he photographed the Cologne tablet, was writing what would have been the first published account of the 8-stage Sumerian description of dying. He had not yet completed the account when he had his own heart attack and went, in his own person, through the 8 stages he had been about to describe. The 8 lines Lawson wrote in his hospital bed in Hamburg during the 30 hours of his final consciousness are not, in the strict sense, a publication. They were not peer-reviewed. They were not edited. They were not even, in any formal sense, a manuscript. They were 8 numbered lines on a sheet of hospital paper, written by a man who knew he was dying and who had just done so, briefly, and had come back. They were, however, written by a man who had spent the previous decade of his life reading Sumerian descriptions of the 8 stages, and who had then experienced the 8 stages himself, and who had returned and used the time available to him to write down what he had experienced. The lines match the tablets. The lines are in the same order. The lines use the same descriptive terms, translated into German but recognizably the same. The lines are, in their content and their structure, a personal confirmation, by a researcher in the late 20th century, of a description that had been recorded by a scribe in the late 3rd millennium before the Common Era. The lines are, in the most precise sense, a check on the pattern. The pattern checks out. The 8 stages are real. Lawson, having been to them and back, confirmed it on paper before he died for the second and final time. His papers, including the photographs of the Cologne tablet and the 8 lines from the hospital, are at the University of Tübingen, in the personal archive of the colleague he gave them to before his death. The archive is not closed. Access to it requires correspondence with the colleague, who is now retired and lives in a village near Stuttgart, and who has, in my own correspondence with him, I've been willing to discuss the material in general terms, but has not been willing to authorize its publication. His reasons for declining publication are his own. The material exists. The pattern exists. The 8 stages, as the Sumerians described them and as Lawson confirmed them, are documented in his archive, and could, in principle, be made available to anyone who pursued the matter with sufficient persistence. What is also documented, in a way that is more publicly available, is the modern medical literature on the near-death experience. The patients, the case files, the clinical studies, the published papers, the proceedings of the International Association for Near-Death Studies, the reports of Moody and Grayson and Van Lommel and Ring and Parnia and Atwater and the dozens of other researchers who have contributed to the field. This literature is large. This literature is growing. This literature has, over the course of the last half-century, established beyond any reasonable doubt that what people experience during clinical death is consistent across cultures, across centuries, across categories of patient and categories of cause of death, and that the experience has a definite structure with definite stages that proceed in a definite order. The structure that the modern literature has established, by working backward from thousands of independent case reports, is the structure that the Sumerian scribes wrote down on 8 tablets 4,000 years ago. The standing apart, the Kaskal with its 7 gates, the light of On, the Mupad with its recitation and its perspective shift, the threshold and the choice, the Dikud Imin of the 7, the A, Sheg, the bathing, the Silima, Nutilla, and the recall with its reversal and its impact and its sealing of certain memories while leaving others available. The Sumerians did not invent this structure. They described it. They wrote it down. They knew it. And the modern patients, having experienced it themselves under conditions of clinical death in modern hospitals, confirm what the Sumerians knew, in the same order, with the same features, with a precision that, when laid out across the 8 tablets and the 8 stages of the modern literature, cannot be dismissed as coincidence. The question that this raises, and that I have been unable to set aside in the months I have spent gathering this material, is the question of where the Sumerian knowledge came from. The Sumerians themselves were specific about it. They said the knowledge came from the Anunnaki. They said the Anunnaki taught it to them. They said the Anunnaki, who had come down from the sky, who had established the cities of the southern plain, who had withdrawn after a long period of presence into the great below, were the ones who oversaw the 8 stages and who had, at some point in the early history of the Sumerian civilization, transmitted the knowledge of the 8 stages to human scribes for the purpose of having it written down. This claim, in the standard scholarly treatment, is dismissed as mythology. The Anunnaki are categorized as gods. The descent and the upper realm presence and the withdrawal are categorized as cosmological narrative. The transmission of the knowledge is categorized as the kind of revelation story that every religion produces in its founding period. The standard treatment categorizes all of this as belief, as story, as the kind of thing that a pre-scientific culture would invent to explain phenomena it did not have the conceptual tools to address scientifically. The standard treatment is not adequate to the evidence. The evidence is the 8 tablets. The evidence is the 8 modern stages. The evidence is the match between them. The match is not the kind of match that a pre-scientific culture would invent. The match is the kind of match that 2 independent observers would produce when describing the same phenomenon. The Sumerians, in their framework, were observing something. The modern patients, in their framework, are observing the same thing. The 2 frameworks are different. The phenomenon being observed is the same. And the simplest, most parsimonious account of the match is that the Sumerians knew about the 8 stages because someone or something had taught them about the 8 stages, and that the someone or something was, in their own framework, the Anunnaki. The question of what the Anunnaki are, in any framework other than the Sumerian framework, is a question I do not propose to answer in this script. I do not know what they are. I have my suspicions. The texts say they came from the sky. The texts say they withdrew into the great below. The texts say they oversee the passage of every Giddim through the 8 stages. The texts are what they are. The patients are what they are. The match is what it is. What you do with the match is up to you. What I can say, with some confidence, is that the 8-stage description of dying that emerges from the 8 Sumerian tablets is not a description that mainstream archaeology, mainstream Assyriology, or mainstream medical science is well positioned to address. Each of those fields, working within its own boundaries, has produced part of the picture. Assyriology has translated the tablets. Medicine has documented the modern experiences. Archaeology has dated and provenanced the artifacts. But the picture as a whole, the synthesis of the 8 tablets and the 8 stages, requires moving across the boundaries of the established fields and across the boundaries of what is considered respectable inquiry and into a territory that does not have a name and that does not have a department in any university. This is, in part, why the synthesis has not been published. The scholars who have come close to it have generally been working in one of the established fields and have not been willing to risk their professional standing by crossing into the others. The independent researchers who have crossed the boundaries have generally not had the linguistic training to handle the Sumerian texts at the level required, and have produced popular treatments that do not survive scrutiny by the specialists. The result has been a stalemate. The specialists have not crossed over. The crossers over have not had the skills. The synthesis has remained in the gap between, in the territory that requires both the philology and the medicine, and the willingness to follow the evidence where it leads regardless of what it implies about the prehistory of the human race. It implies, if you allow it to imply, a great deal. It implies that the Sumerians had access to information about death that the rest of the ancient world did not have, and that the modern world has only recently begun to recover. It implies that the source of that information, whatever it was external to the Sumerians themselves, in the sense that they did not invent it but received it. It implies that the 8-stage structure of dying is a real feature of what happens when a human being dies, regardless of culture, regardless of belief, regardless of any framework the patient brings to the experience. It implies that the modern medical literature, in documenting the near-death experience, has been recovering, piece by piece, a body of knowledge that was once held in a more complete form by a civilization that flourished and disappeared more than 4,000 years ago. It implies, finally, that the framework the Sumerians used to make sense of this knowledge, the framework of the Giddim and the Kur and the Anunnaki and the 7 judges, may not be wholly mythological. It may be partly accurate. It may be a framework that, although wrapped in the language of an ancient religion, is pointing at something real, something structural, something that is present in every dying experience and that has been there for as long as human beings have been dying. The framework, on this reading, is not the truth. The framework is a description of the truth in the language available to a particular culture at a particular time. The truth itself, the 8 stages, the structure, the passage from the form to the place of the sweet water by way of the 7 gates and the light and the mupad and the threshold and the 7 who decide, is a truth that does not depend on the framework. The truth is its own thing. The framework is one way of describing it. The modern medical literature is another way of describing it. The clinical language of the near-death experience, with its terminology of out-of-body experience and tunnel and life review and boundary and encounter with beings and absolute peace and return, is the framework of our own time. It is no more the truth than the Sumerian framework was the truth. It is a description, in our own vocabulary, of the same 8 stages that the Sumerian scribe described in his vocabulary. The 2 descriptions match because they are describing the same thing. The thing they are describing is not produced by the language used to describe it. The thing is real. The descriptions are descriptions. Where this leaves us, as people who are alive and who will eventually not be alive, is in a particular position with respect to our own deaths. We know now what the 8 stages are. We know the order. We know what each stage involves. We know from the modern reports and from the Sumerian descriptions what to expect. The standing apart, the kaskal, the light, the mupad, the threshold, the daikudimin, the sheg, and, if our deaths are not yet complete, the recall. This knowledge does not make death less serious. It does not make the loss of those we love less painful. It does not, in any way that I have been able to identify, change the practical fact that the form, when the breath leaves it, ceases to be available to us in the upper world. The form is buried or cremated. The form is gone. What the 8 stages tell us is that the form is not the whole story. The Giddim, whatever the Giddim is, continues. The Giddim passes through the stages. The Giddim arrives, in most cases, at the bathing, at the silima nutila, at the rest that does not end. The form is in the ground. The Giddim is in the place of the sweet water. The 2 are not the same. The 2 were never the same. And the Sumerians, 4,000 years ago, knew this with a confidence that the modern world has only recently begun to recover. What this knowledge asks of us, in our own time, is something I would put forward as the closing thought of this presentation. The knowledge asks of us that we take our own lives more seriously than we have been in the habit of taking them. The mupad, the life review is going to come. The recitation is going to happen. The perspective shift is going to happen. We are going to see, in some manner, that the patients have struggled to describe, and the scribes have struggled to articulate every interaction of our lives from the position of those we interacted with. We are going to know what we did. We are going to feel how it felt to be on the receiving end of what we did. The mupad is not a punishment. It is a seeing. But the seeing is comprehensive, and the seeing is unavoidable, and the seeing is, in the testimony of those who have experienced it, the most demanding thing they have ever been through. If we know this is coming, we have in the time available to us in the upper world, the opportunity to act with the mupad in mind. To act in such a way that what we will see, when we see it from both sides, is what we will not be ashamed to see. To act in such a way that the recitation will not contain things we would have spared ourselves and others. To act in such a way that the bathing, when we arrive at it, will feel earned. In some sense, the framework does not require, but in which the framework permits. This is what the 8 tablets, in my reading of them, are finally saying. They are not just describing what happens when we die. They are also, implicitly, telling us how to live. They are telling us that the way we live will determine what we see in the mupad. They are telling us that the 8 stages are not separate from the life that precedes them. They are telling us that the Gidam that arrives at the threshold is the Gidam that was shaped by the life it lived in the form, and that the life it lived is, in some sense, the only thing it will bring with it through the 7 gates, into the light, before the 7, and into the place of the sweet water. The Sumerians knew this. The modern patients, in their own vocabulary, know it. The 8 tablets, taken together, are a teaching as much as they are a description. They are a teaching that has been available in scattered form for 4,000 years, and that is only now, in our own century, being gathered together and recognized for what it is. What you do with the teaching is your affair. The 8 tablets exist. The 8 stages exist. The match between the ancient and the modern descriptions exists. The pattern is there. The pattern is in the literature. The pattern is in the museums. The standing apart, when it comes to you, will not be a surprise. The Kaskal will not be a surprise. The light will not be a surprise. The mupad will not be a surprise. The threshold will not be a surprise. The dikudamin will not be a surprise. The sheg will not be a surprise. The recall, if it comes, will not be a surprise. You will know what each of them is. You will know the order. You will know what is being asked of you at each stage. You will know that the Gidam that walks the Kaskal is the Gidam that was shaped by the life that preceded the standing apart. You will know that the choice at the threshold is yours to make. You will know that the 7, when you stand before them, will see everything, and that you will see everything in their seeing. The Sumerians wrote it down. The modern patients have reported it. The 8 stages are the 8 stages. The order is the order. What comes after the bathing, for those who are not recalled, the tablets do not describe. There are no 9th stage tablets. There are no descriptions of what happens after the Silama Nutilla. The scribes did not write about it, either because the Gidam that has been transformed cannot communicate with the upper world, or because the upper world does not have the vocabulary for what comes next, or because what comes next is, in the framework of the scribes themselves, not a matter for the upper world at all. The bathing is, in the scribes' framing, the end of the description and the beginning of the silence. The Gidam is in the place of the sweet water. The Gidam is in the rest that does not end. What the Gidam does there, what the Gidam becomes there, what the Gidam is now in any sense that the upper world can grasp, is a matter the 8 tablets do not address. It is, for the Sumerians and for us, the thing that lies beyond the 8 stages. The thing that is not the dying. The thing that is, in the framework, the destination. The bathing was preparation. The placing was preparation. The 8 stages, all 8 of them, were preparation. What they were preparation for, the tablets do not say. But the tablets have done their work. They have given us the 8 stages. They have given us the order. They have given us 4,000 years after they were inscribed and rediscovered by modern researchers and laid alongside the modern reports of the people who have died and come back, the knowledge of what is coming. We know what is coming. The Sumerians knew. The patients in the hospitals know. The 8 tablets in the 8 museums know. And now, having walked through the 8 descriptions in the exact order the scribes wrote them, you know too. That is what the tablet said. That is what the patients have reported. That is the match. One last observation before the recording ends. The 8 tablets, considered together, raise a question that I have not addressed directly in this presentation, and that I would like to leave you with as the final thought of the evening. The question is the question of why this material has not been gathered together and published, why no major university has taken it on as a research program, why the Cologne tablet, which would have organized the longer texts into a single sequence, has been in a private collection for more than 100 years without being subjected to systematic study. Why Lawson's papers, which contain photographs and notes that would have allowed any competent researcher to reconstruct the sequence, have remained in a private archive in Tübingen, rather than being made public. Why the medical literature on the near-death experience, which contains thousands of accounts that match the Sumerian descriptions in detail, has not been laid alongside the Sumerian descriptions by any mainstream researcher. The match is there. The evidence is there. The pieces are in the museums, and in the medical journals and in the archives. The synthesis has not been made. You are in possession, now, of the same information the scribes were in possession of 4,000 years ago, and of the same information the modern patients have reported. You know the 8 stages. You know the order. The standing apart is the first, the cascal is the second, the light is the third, the mupad is the fourth, the threshold is the fifth, the decudamin is the sixth, the bathing is the seventh, the recall, if it comes, is the eighth. What the 8 stages are is what they are. What you do with the knowledge of them is what you do. This has been the description of what the Sumerians wrote down and what the modern patients have reported. Whether the pattern is what the Sumerians thought it was, whether the Anunnaki are what they themselves are reported to be, whether the Giddim continues in the form the texts describe, are questions the descriptions do not finally settle. The questions remain open. What is no longer open, in my view, is the question of whether the pattern is real. The pattern is real. The pattern is documented. The pattern is in the tablets, and in the case files, and in the medical literature, and in the photographs Lawson took in Cologne in 1987. The 8 tablets exist. The 8 stages exist. The match between them is the thing that this presentation has been about. You have heard it now. You will not, I think, forget it. That is the description. That is the order. That is what was on the tablets.